Vernon Slade's boot connected with the door of the Copperidge Infirmary, so hard the hinges screamed. "Get out." He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "That woman and her brat are not your concern, doctor. You touch them, you lose your lease. I own this building. I own 3 others you rent on this street. Think carefully." Dr. Prentice stood frozen behind his desk, one hand still holding the bag he'd been reaching for. Slade straightened his coat. Good man. Outside, in the January dark, a mother pressed her feverish child tighter against her chest and understood that no one in Copper Ridge was going to help her. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to our channel right now so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it started and how one man's promise changed everything. The snow had been falling since noon, and by the time Mara Ellsworth reached the edge of Copper Ridge, it was coming down sideways. She had Toby wrapped in her coat, her actual coat, not a blanket, because the blanket had soaked through 2 hours outside of Dunmore, and she'd made the only decision available to her. He was 3 years old and burning with fever, and she could feel the heat of him, even through the wool, which should have been a comfort but wasn't, because heat like that in a child his age wasn't the body fighting. It was the body losing. She'd been walking since daybreak. Her boots had separated at the left sole somewhere around the creek crossing, and now each step packed snow directly against her foot. She'd stopped feeling it about a mile back. That probably should have worried her more than it did, but Mara Ellsworth had run out of room to worry about herself. Every bit of fear she still had was pointed at the small, shuddering weight in her arms. "Almost there, baby," she said, though she'd been saying that since she first spotted the ridge. Almost there. Toby didn't answer. He hadn't said anything in about 40 minutes. The town materialized out of the blizzard the way towns do in bad weather, slowly, reluctantly, a smear of lamplight and dark shapes that gradually grew edges. A livery stable, a general store, a row of attached buildings she couldn't read the signs on yet. Her eyes were watering from the wind and she kept blinking, trying to clear them. She headed for the nearest light. It was a boarding house, a 2-story building with yellow light pressing through frosted windows and smoke coming off the chimney in great luxurious curls. Mara climbed the porch steps one at a time because her legs weren't responding quite right and pushed through the door. The warmth hit her like a wall. She almost sat down on the floor. The woman at the front desk looked up from her ledger. She was heavyset, with a tight gray bun and eyes that calculated value the way a butcher calculates a cut of meat. "I need a room," Mara said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "My son is sick. I have a job offer at the Harlan spread. I just need 1 night until I can." "Harlan spread burned down," the woman said, 6 weeks ago. Harlan moved his family to Denver. Mara stood very still. "The job," she said carefully. "I was told I have a letter." "Then you were told wrong. Or the letter's old. Either way, I can't help you." "He has a fever. He's 3 years old. I can see that." The woman's voice wasn't cruel. That was almost worse. It was simply done, finished, settled, no further discussion possible. "I'm sorry for your trouble, but I've got my own guests to think about, and I can't have sickness spreading through a full house." "1 night," Mara said. "I'll pay you back. I can cook, I can mend, I can—" "No credit. House rule." The woman looked back down at her ledger. "The church on Birch Street sometimes helps travelers. Try there." Mara stood in that warm room for 3 more seconds, trying to find something useful to say. Nothing came. She turned around and walked back out into the snow. She tried the general store next. The owner, a lean, nervous man with an apron and ink-stained fingers, heard her out while stacking cans on a shelf, not quite looking at her. "I feel for you, I do," he said. "But we don't give credit to folks we don't know. No way to know if you'll still be here come spring. My son might not make it to spring if he doesn't get warm tonight." The man finally looked at her. She watched him want to help. She watched him decide not to. "There's a doctor on the main drag. Prentice. He might—" "Thank you," Mara said, because she'd learned years ago that anger used up energy she couldn't afford. Dr. Prentice's office was on the main street, a narrow building wedged between a land office and a saddler. The sign on the door said closed, but there was a light inside, And Mara knocked anyway. Then knocked again. Then tried the handle. The door opened. Dr. Prentice was a small man, 50s, wire-rimmed glasses halfway down his nose. He looked up from his desk when she came in, and she saw his eyes go immediately to Toby, the way a doctor's eyes do, taking stock. "He's feverish," he said. "It wasn't a question since yesterday morning. I've been traveling. I don't have money right now, but I can." The doctor had already gotten up and was reaching for his bag. That was when the door opened behind Mara. She turned around. The man who walked in wasn't large in a threatening way. He was large the way a courthouse is large, solid and permanent, and uninterested in your opinion about its size. He wore a heavy coat with a fur collar and boots that cost more than Mara's husband had made in his best month. His face was handsome if you didn't look too long, the kind of face that had learned to arrange itself into whatever expression was most useful. He looked at Mara. He looked at Toby. Then he looked at the doctor. "Dr. Prentice," the man said pleasantly. "I thought we'd talked about this." The doctor's hands had stopped moving. "Mr. Slade." "The building you practice in," Vernon Slade said, "still pleasant, still almost kind, is mine. The building next door where you sleep is mine. I've been patient about the rent situation because I understand you have a generous heart, but generosity has a cost, and I've been absorbing it long enough. She has a sick child. She has a sick child who is not from this town and not your responsibility." Slade's voice didn't change pitch or temperature. That was the frightening part. "You treat her, you use my building to do it, and I'll have the locks changed by morning. Clear?" Dr. Prentice looked at Mara. Mara looked at him. He sat back down. He put his bag on the desk. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Can't." Mara didn't argue. She understood, in some deep and exhausted part of herself, that this was not about the doctor's character. She'd met Vernon Slade's type before her husband had tried to borrow from one, years back, and they'd spent 2 years working off a debt that had started at $50, and somehow never got smaller. She knew what this man was. She knew there was no argument she could make that he would hear. She pulled Toby tighter and walked out. The cold came back for her immediately, enthusiastic, like it had been waiting. She stood on the boardwalk in front of the doctor's office and tried to think. Church, the boarding house woman had said. Mara had tried that too, between the general store and the doctor. The church was dark. A hand-lettered sign said the pastor had gone to Rawlins for a family emergency and would return in a week. A week. She looked down the street, lamplight in windows. Smoke from chimneys. A whole town full of warm people making reasonable decisions. Toby made a small sound against her neck. Not a word. Not a cry. Just a sound, like he was having a conversation in a dream. "I know," she told him. "I know." She'd heard about a settlement about 9 miles East Bridger's Crossing, they called it, though she wasn't sure if it was big enough to have a doctor. 9 miles in this weather at night, with a child who was all readings. Her boot hit ice and she caught herself on a porch post. When she looked up, a man was standing in the street watching her. He was tall and weather-worn, somewhere in his late 30s, with a dark hat pulled low and a coat that had seen serious work. His horse, a dark roan, big and solid, stood patient behind him. He'd been tying something to his saddlebag and had stopped midway through the motion. He was just looking at her. Most people, when they looked at Mara tonight, looked and then looked away. They'd made the calculation, found it inconvenient, and moved their eyes somewhere less complicated. This man didn't look away. "Where are you headed?" he said. Mara almost laughed. "Bridger's Crossing. In this weather." "With that child." "I'm aware of the weather." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of discomfort more, the quiet of a man who'd learned that silence was useful. He looked at Toby's face, visible above the collar of Mara's coat, and something moved behind his eyes. Something she couldn't quite name. "How long has he been like that?" "Since yesterday. And nobody in town. The boarding house, the store, and the doctor," Mara said flatly. Covered the obvious options. He absorbed this. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked back down the street toward the doctor's office, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it behind his teeth. "I'm Rourke Maddox," he said. "I've got a ranch 4 miles north. Iron Willow. You come with me. The boy gets a bed and a fire tonight. Tomorrow we figure out the rest. I don't know you." "No," he said. You don't. Why would you? Because he's sick and it's 20 degrees and you've got no options. His voice was blunt, not unkind, the same tone he might use to explain which pasture was flooded. Look, I'm not asking for anything. I'm just saying. You can keep walking to Bridger's Crossing in the dark in a blizzard, or you can take the shelter that's offered. Either way, it's your choice. Mara studied him. She'd been good at reading people once, before the years of debt and loss had worn the habit dull. She looked at his hands calloused, cracked at the knuckles, real working hands. She looked at how he stood with his horse, the easy familiarity of it. She looked at his eyes, which were gray and direct and not performing anything. I can work, she said. I won't be your charity case. Fine, I mean it. So do I. He turned to his horse and checked the cinch. I've got a roan and a pack mare. You take the roan, I'll walk. You don't have to. I know I don't. He said it without impatience. Come on. Weather's getting worse, it was. The wind had shifted and the snow was coming down thicker now, the kind of snow that muffles sound and erases landmarks, and turns a 4-mile ride into a genuine question of whether you'd come out the other side. Rourke helped her up onto the roan-held Toby, while she got her foot in the stirrup, handed the boy back without fumbling or hesitating, like he'd handled a child before, or at least wasn't frightened of the idea. He settled Toby against Mara's chest and made sure she had a grip before he let go. Then he took the roan's lead rope and started walking. He didn't say much on the ride. She asked him once if he had family at the ranch, and he said just his hands, 3 of them, and a foreman named Gil. She asked how far again, and he said less than an hour in this. She asked why he'd been in town, and he said supplies, and left it there. She didn't push. She was too tired to push, and honestly too occupied with keeping Toby from sliding and trying not to show how badly her hands were shaking. They made Iron Willow in 40 minutes. The ranch yard appeared first, a dark bulk of fencing with lantern light at the barn doors. Then the house itself, a low, solid structure that had clearly been built to survive Wyoming winters, rather than impress anyone passing through. Rourke called out as they came through the gate. "Gil!" A man emerged from the barn, Gil, apparently. 50s, barrel-chested, with a beard that had been gray so long it was almost white. He took one look at the situation and didn't ask questions. "Get inside," he told Mara. "I'll see to the horse." The inside of the house was not elegant. The floor was bare board, the furniture was heavy and practical, and everything smelled of wood smoke and something that might have been coffee, or might have been the memory of coffee. But there was a fire in the hearth that had been properly laid and properly tended, throwing serious heat. Mara sat down in front of it and pulled Toby's coat off with fingers that barely cooperated. Felt lighter than he should have. She pressed her hand to his forehead and her stomach dropped. "He's hotter than when I checked an hour ago." Rourke had followed her in. He was still in his coat, still thinking. Prentice is the only doctor within 30 miles. "Slade. I know about Slade." He looked at her. "You know his name?" "I know his type." She was unwrapping Toby's scarf, moving his arms gently to check for rash, or swelling, for any of the signs that would tell her what they were dealing with. "He came to the doctor's office while I was there. Said he owned the building. Said he'd change the locks if Prentice treated me." Rourke was quiet. "I understand that's not your problem," Mara said. She didn't say it bitterly. "You've already done more than mites." "Stop," he said it quietly. "I'm not calculating what's my problem. I'm thinking about how to get the doctor out here without Slade knowing about it." She looked up. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Toby, at the flush in the boy's face, and the labored way his small chest was moving, and there was something in Rourke's expression that Mara couldn't categorize. It wasn't pity. It wasn't obligation. It was something older than either of those, something that lived in the part of a person that hasn't been taught yet to be careful. "Gil," he called. The foreman appeared from the back hallway. "Saddle Henry," Rourke said, "the brown. Not the gray can't handle drifts. Go around the south edge of Elkins Field, coming to town from the mill road. Prentice's back door is off the alley. Knock quiet. Tell him Rourke Maddox's ranch. Tell him to come in his own wagon and not tell anyone." Gil looked at the child. He nodded once and left. Rourke looked at Mara. "Henry's our steadiest horse. If anyone can make that trip in this weather, he can." He hesitated. "No guarantees Prentice will come. Slade's got him pretty pinned down. I know, but he might. Rourke moved to the fire, added a log, adjusted the damper. In the meantime, you need dry clothes. There's a chest in the second room with some of my sister's things. She visited 2 summers ago and left half her trunk. She's about your size. Your sister. She won't mind. She's not here. He straightened up. Are you hungry? Mara tried to remember when she'd last eaten. Lunch, maybe. A biscuit she'd been saving, eaten on the road before the weather got bad. A little, she said, which was not the truth, but she wasn't yet sure how much honesty was safe. There's stew from supper. It's not fancy. I don't need fancy. He nodded and went to the kitchen. Mara sat on the floor in front of the fire with Toby in her lap and let herself, just for a moment, stop. She put her nose against the top of his head, felt the heat of his fever and the soft mess of his hair, and closed her eyes. She'd made it through the debt collectors after James died. She'd made it through the auction of their freight wagon, and the equipment, and then the horse, and then most of what was in the house. She'd made it through 3 months of letter writing, trying to find any relation of James's who might take them in, and every letter coming back polite and useless. She'd made it through the train to Dunmore, and the discovery that the Harlan Ranch job, which she'd arranged through a freight contact, was no longer available, a fact that had apparently been true for 6 weeks, but nobody had seen fit to tell her. She'd made it through all of that. She could make it through this. Toby stirred in her arms. His eyes opened unfocused, too bright. Mama, he said. Right here, she told him. Right here. Thirsty. She looked up. Rourke had appeared in the kitchen doorway, and he'd apparently heard, because he had a cup of water in his hand already. He crossed the room and crouched down and held the cup for Toby, with a patience that surprised her. Didn't rush him, didn't tilt it too fast, just held it steady while the boy drank. Toby looked at him afterward. Who's that? That's Mr. Maddox, Mara said. He's letting us stay here tonight. Toby considered this with the seriousness of a 3-year-old processing new information. Does he have horses? He does, Rourke said. Big ones? Pretty big. Toby seemed satisfied. He settled back against Mara's chest and closed his eyes. Rourke stood up. He looked at the boy for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked at Mara, and there was something in his face that he didn't try to hide and didn't try to show. It was just there, plain and unguarded. The face of a man who had just made a decision he wasn't going to unmake. That boy won't spend another night without a roof, he said, as long as I own one. He said it quietly, not like a speech, not like he was trying to impress her, just like a statement of something that had become, in the last 30 seconds, simply true. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She'd learned to be careful about men who made promises. She'd married one who'd meant every word and still died anyway, leaving her with nothing but the debt and the boy. She'd met others who made promises, like they were spending other people's money. She'd gotten reasonably good at telling the difference. She wasn't sure which kind this was yet, but Toby was burning with fever, and there was a fire in the hearth, and somewhere in the Wyoming dark, a steady brown horse was picking his way through drifts toward a doctor who might or might not come. Thank you, she said. It wasn't agreement, it wasn't trust. It was just the only word she had left. Rourke nodded and went back to the kitchen, and Mara pulled Toby closer and watched the fire and listened to the blizzard throw itself against the walls of Iron Willow Ranch. And somewhere in the sound of it, she thought she could almost hear Copper Ridge going about its evening boarding house. Locked, general store shuttered. Doctor sitting behind his desk with his bag on the shelf, all those warm, reasonable people making reasonable choices. And Slade. Slade somewhere in that town, in some warm room, not thinking about a feverish 3-year-old or a woman with a broken boot sole, not thinking about them at all, because they were not yet a problem worth his attention. Not yet. The stew was not fancy. It was exactly what it was, tough beef and winter vegetables, and a broth that tasted like the cook had been feeding ranch hands, not guests. Mara ate it, sitting on the floor by the fire with Toby asleep against her side, and she ate all of it, and she did not apologize for that. Gil got back close to midnight. She heard the horse come in and heard voices in the yard, and then the back door, and then Rourke came through the front room and stopped. Prentice is here. She stood up fast. The doctor came in with his bag and his hat dripping snow, and an expression that suggested he had considered not coming at least twice on the road out. He looked at Mara and then away, and she understood that this was its own kind of apology. Not the kind you say out loud, but the kind you perform by showing up anyway. He examined Toby on the table in the kitchen, moving methodically through the things a doctor checks. Rourke had lit every lamp in the room. Mara stood to the side and watched, and tried to read what Prentice's hands were telling her before his mouth did. Finally, the doctor straightened. Fever's high. He's dehydrated, not critically, but you need to get fluids into him tonight. Small amounts, frequently. No solid food until tomorrow afternoon. He reached into his bag and produced a small bottle. This is a tincture willow bark and a few other things. Quarter of this in warm water every 4 hours. Keep him warm. Keep him still. Well, he's young and he seems otherwise sturdy. If the fever breaks by morning, he should come through fine. Prentice paused. If it doesn't break, send for me again. He looked at Rourke, not at Mara, when he said the next part, I'm going to need to get back before sunrise. Before anyone notices my wagon was gone. Understood, Rourke said. I'll have Gil ride with you to the property line. Prentice nodded. He picked up his bag. He got to the door and stopped, his back to both of them. There are other ranchers, he said carefully, who've had similar situations with Slade. Similar pressure applied. I'm just saying, if you were ever in a position to do anything about that, there are people in this valley who'd be grateful. He left without waiting for an answer. Mara stood in the kitchen and let the sentence sit in the air between her and Rourke. He's taking ranches, she said. He's been at it 2 years, maybe 3, Rourke said. Buys up debts, applies pressure, forecloses when the payments slip. Legal, mostly. Or legal enough, is Iron Willow. We're behind, he said. It came out flat and final, the kind of tone a person uses when they've said the same thing to themselves enough times that it's lost its ability to hurt. Not critically, but behind. The cattle count's been off this year and I can't figure out why. Feed bills came in higher than they should have. Mara looked at him. Keep records? Of course I keep records. Detailed ones? Purchase orders, head counts, comparative tallies, season over season. He frowned slightly. Why? Because if someone's manipulating your debt, the evidence will be in the discrepancy between what your records say happened and what actually happened. She stopped herself. I'm sorry, I'm overstepping. You didn't ask for. Where did you learn to do that, he said. My husband ran a freight business. I kept books for 6 years. She looked at her hands. It's how I know we weren't broke when he died. We should have had enough to keep the business. Somehow we didn't. Rourke was quiet for a moment. I'll get you the ledgers in the morning, he said. You don't have to. I said I'd get them. He moved to the kitchen doorway. There's a room at the end of the hall. Small, but it's warm. You can put the boy in there. Mara almost said something more. She had a tendency, which she'd been working on for years, to fill silences with explanations that nobody had asked for. Closed her mouth. Good night, she said instead. Good night, he said. She lay awake for a long time that night, with Toby curled against her, his fever still high but not rising, listening to his breathing and counting the seconds between each exhale. Every 4 hours she lifted him gently and coaxed willow bark tincture into him and laid him back down and watched his face. Around 3 in the morning, she heard something in the main room boots on floorboards, slow and careful. Stiffened. Then she recognized the weight of the steps, the particular length of stride. Rourke, she heard him stop outside the door, a long pause. Then he moved away, back toward the front of the house, and a door opened and closed. He'd been checking. Just checking. Mara turned onto her back and stared at the dark ceiling. She had approximately $12.40 to her name. She had a dead husband's debts, a sick 3-year-old, and a job offer that had burned down with the Harlan Ranch. She was sleeping in a stranger's house, in a town that had already demonstrated, in no uncertain terms, what it thought of her. And somehow, despite all of that, this was the first time in 11 months that she'd felt like help might be possible. Not rescue, not charity, just help. The kind you can accept without giving up what's yours. She filed that feeling away carefully in the part of herself where she kept things she wasn't ready to look at yet. By morning, Toby's fever had broken. He woke up asking for breakfast and complaining that his legs were stiff, and Mara sat on the edge of the bed and let him be annoyed about his stiff legs for a full 2 minutes, because his voice was clear and his eyes were focused, and when she put her hand to his forehead, the terrible heat was gone. Pressed her fist to her mouth, just for a second, just until she got herself back. Then she helped him sit up and went to find out where the kitchen was and whether there was anything she could use to make breakfast for a household that had apparently just adopted her. Rourke was already in the kitchen. So was Gil and 2 younger ranch hands brothers, she'd learn later, named Ellis and Dan Pruitt, who were clearly in the middle of morning coffee and were equally clearly not sure what to make of her. "He's awake," Mara said. "Fever's gone." Something moved across Rourke's face brief, almost invisible. "Good. I'd like to make breakfast. If that's all right." Gil looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at Mara. "You don't have to." "I know I don't." She was already moving to the pantry. "You have eggs?" 3 dozen last I checked. "Flour?" "Yep." "Then I can make something worth eating." She started taking inventory. "Also, when you have a moment, I'd like to see those ledgers." There was a pause behind her. "It's 6 in the morning," Rourke said. "I know what time it is." She found the flour sack and set it on the counter. "I also know that if Slade's running the kind of scheme I think he's running, he doesn't do it only to you. He does it to everyone who owes him anything. And if I can find the pattern in your books, you might be able to warn other ranchers before they lose what you almost lost." Another pause. Longer this time. "Almost?" one of the Pruitt brothers said. "You haven't lost it yet," Mara said. She started measuring flour. Behind her, she heard someone set down a coffee cup, and then the sound of Rourke going to whatever room he kept his files in. The ledgers landed on the kitchen table 10 minutes later, 4 of them, heavy and battered. Mara cooked breakfast with one eye on the numbers. By the time the eggs were done, she had already found 3 things that didn't add up. She didn't say anything yet. She needed to be sure. She needed to go through all 4 books, cross-reference the cattle head counts against the purchase records, and compare the feed invoices against what the acreage could reasonably require. But she was already sure. The wrongness in those numbers had a specific shape, not chaos, not accident. Patient and deliberate and aimed. Someone had been slowly, methodically bleeding Iron Willow Ranch for at least 18 months, adjusting numbers just enough to avoid immediate notice, just enough to compound quietly into catastrophe. Someone who understood exactly how a freight business failed. Someone who'd done this before. Mara set a plate in front of Rourke without comment. He looked at her. "You found something." "I found several things." She sat down across from him with her own plate. "Give me the rest of today, with the books. Tonight I'll tell you what I know." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," she ate. He ate. The ranch hands ate. Toby appeared in the doorway in his sock feet, surveying the room with the imperious calm of a child who has decided to forgive his circumstances. "Are those the big horses?" he asked, pointing vaguely toward the window. "Those are the big horses," Rourke confirmed. "Can I see them?" "After breakfast." Toby considered this. Then he crossed the kitchen and climbed into the chair next to Rourke and picked up a fork with absolute confidence, as though this were simply where he sat. Rourke looked at the boy, then at Mara, then back at his plate. He didn't say anything, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed, loosened, almost like a rope that had been carrying weight so long it had forgotten what slack felt like. Mara watched that happen and did not remark on it. She had a ledger to finish, and a scheme to untangle and a town to eventually face, and she was going to need every bit of the steadiness she'd spent 11 months building. But right now, in this kitchen, on this morning, Toby was eating breakfast, and Rourke Maddox was letting him. And somewhere down the street, Vernon Slade was waking up confident that the penniless widow he'd driven out of the doctor's office had continued on to Bridger's Crossing and was now somebody else's problem. He was going to have to revise that calculation. Mara turned a page in the ledger and kept reading. The numbers didn't lie. That was the thing about numbers. They couldn't be charmed, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be paid off. They just sat there on the page and told you exactly what had happened if you knew how to read them. Mara knew how to read them. She'd spent the better part of that first day at the kitchen table while Toby slept, and the ranch hands moved in and out for lunch and coffee, and whatever else brought men through a kitchen 7 times in an afternoon. She'd asked for a piece of blank paper and a pencil, and nobody had questioned it, and she'd worked through all 4 of Rourke's ledgers the way her husband had taught her column by column, cross-referenced, nothing assumed. By the time the light through the kitchen window turned orange and the temperature dropped hard toward evening, she had 6 pages of notes and a very specific anger sitting in her chest. Rourke came in from the barn, smelling of horses and cold, and found her still at the table. "Supper's going to be late," she said without looking up. "I lost track of time. I'm sorry. I'm not asking about supper." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What did you find?" She set her pencil down and looked at her notes. "Not at him, not yet. Your cattle losses," she said. "They started 18 months ago, small at first for head here, 6 there. The kind of numbers that could be weather or predators or just the usual bad luck of ranching. But it was consistent. Same approximate loss every 3 to 4 weeks. I noticed the losses. I couldn't find a pattern. The pattern is in the timing, not the amount." She pushed one of her pages toward him. "Look at the dates. Every loss happens within 3 days of a scheduled head count, which means whoever's doing it knows your schedule." Rourke's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything. "The feed invoices are worse," she said. "You're being charged for quantities that would feed approximately 40% more cattle than you run. Either someone at the feed supplier is inflating the invoices, or someone between the supplier and your ranch is skimming the physical feed and pocketing the difference. Either way, you've been paying for feed that never arrived." I checked the deliveries. "Did you weigh the loads?" He stopped. "Because I'd bet," Mara said, "that the loads looked right by volume. Hay compressed in a specific way looks like more than it is. If nobody's weighing it, nobody was weighing it." He said it like it cost him something. "I trusted the count. And whoever set this up knew you trusted the count." She leaned back in her chair. "This isn't random opportunism, Mr. Maddox. This was planned. Someone studied how Iron Willow operates, identified the weaknesses, and built a method around them. This took patience. Months of patience." Rourke looked at her notes for a long moment. "Slade, I think so. I can't prove it from your ledgers alone. But whoever is doing this, they're not just taking from you. This level of organization, this specific methodology, they've done it before. They know exactly how much pressure to apply without triggering a confrontation. They want the debt to grow until you can't meet the mortgage, and then they want to buy the foreclosure, which Slade would be positioned to do. He's the largest cattle buyer in the valley. He controls the local lending through 3 separate arrangements I found referenced in your supply contracts. He owns buildings in town. He's built himself into a position where you can't move without moving through him somehow." She paused. "How many other ranchers are behind on their payments right now?" Rourke thought about it. "Kellerman, the Hatch family. Maybe the Ortega spread, I'm not sure." "Talk to them," Mara said. "Quietly. Ask to see their records. I'd guess you'll find the same pattern." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. Not at the pages, not at the problem, at her. "You figured all this out in one day." "I've been looking for this specific kind of wrong for 2 years, she said. "I just didn't know it until I found it in someone else's books." He understood what she meant. She could see it. The way his expression shifted when he connected it to James, to the freight business, to the debt that had somehow never gotten smaller. He didn't say anything about it, which she appreciated. "I'll go see Kellerman tomorrow," he said. "Don't tell him everything yet. Just ask about the losses and the feed invoices. See what he says without prompting. You've done this before. Negotiations. I've watched people get taken advantage of before. Similar." She started stacking the ledgers. "Now I really do need to start supper. Toby will be hungry when he wakes up." She got up and went to the pantry, and after a moment she heard Rourke's chair scrape back and his boots on the floor, and then the back door opening and closing as he went back out to the barn. She stood in the pantry for a moment and breathed. She was in a stranger's house, eating a stranger's food, sleeping in a stranger's spare room. She had $12.40 and a 6-child and a town that had already shown her, with impressive efficiency, exactly what it thought of her. She had found evidence of a crime she couldn't prove yet and made a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. None of that was comfortable. None of it was safe. But she knew what the numbers said, and for the first time in a very long time, knowing something felt like it might actually be useful. She found a pot and started supper. The next morning, Rourke went to see Kellerman. He didn't take Mara, which was probably wise. She was still a stranger here, and strangers asking to look at your private accounts was a different thing than a neighbor doing it. But he took her list of specific questions, written out on a folded piece of paper, and he was gone most of the morning. Mara spent the time with Toby, who had recovered with the aggressive thoroughness of small children. By the second morning, he was completely fine, and completely bored, and following her everywhere asking questions she couldn't always answer. Why is the fence that color? Because that's the color they painted it. Why did they paint it that color? Because that was the paint they had. Why did they have that paint, Toby? What? Go ask Mr. Maddox's horse. This satisfied him completely, and he spent the next 20 minutes standing at the pasture fence, talking to the roan mare in the intense, private way that small children talk to animals, as though they share a language adults have lost access to. Gil came to stand beside Mara at the fence. He was quiet for a bit, watching Toby. Kids don't usually take to Rourke's animals that fast, he said. Mare's particular. Doesn't like strangers. She's letting him pet her nose. Yeah. Gil was quiet again. Then Rourke built this place from nothing. Came out here with $400 and a bad knee and bought the worst piece of land in the valley because it was what he could afford. Spent 3 years making it something. He paused. Slade's been trying to get this land for 2 years. Good water rights. Rourke won't sell. I know, Mara said. Do you know why Slade wants it specifically? She looked at him. The water. Whoever controls the water source on this property can charge every downstream rancher in the valley. Rourke's been letting people pull from his creek for free since he got here. Old agreement his predecessor made. Slade wants to end that agreement. Mara thought about that. She thought about the other ranches on her list, Kellerman, the Hatch family, Ortega. She thought about how many of them might depend on Iron Willow's creek. If Slade gets this land, she said slowly, he doesn't just get the ranch. He gets leverage over every ranch downstream. Now you're seeing the whole picture, Gil said. He went back to the barn. Mara stood at the fence and watched Toby try to convince the mare to shake hands, and she rearranged everything she thought she'd understood about what Slade was doing. It was so much bigger than she'd realized. Rourke came back at noon with a look on his face that confirmed most of what she'd suspected. He sat down at the kitchen table and put her list in front of her, with checks next to 4 of her 6 questions. Kellerman's losing cattle on the same schedule, he said. He thought it was predators. He hasn't weighed his feedloads in 2 years. He stopped. He got emotional when I asked. He's been blaming himself. Of course he has, Mara said. That's how it works. When the losses don't make sense, people assume they must have made an error. It never occurs to them that someone is engineering the losses. I need to talk to Hatch, yes, and the Ortegas. She sat down. But carefully. If Slade hears that the ranchers are comparing notes, he might accelerate. Call in the debts early, before you have time to build a case. What kind of case? A legal one. She met his eyes. You can't confront Slade directly. You said yourself it's all technically legal. The only way to unwind this is documentation. Every discrepancy, every inflated invoice, every cattle count that doesn't match. Gathered across multiple ranches. Presented to someone with the authority to void the fraudulent claims. The county registrar can void land transfers if fraud is demonstrated, Rourke said slowly. Which means you need a lawyer who isn't in Slade's pocket. There's one in Cheyenne. Harrington. He's been working some land cases in the western counties. Rourke looked at his hands. He's expensive. How expensive is losing Iron Willow? He didn't answer that. This is going to take time, Mara said. Weeks, maybe more. And during that time, Slade is going to keep doing what he's doing. Which means you need to shore up what you can on the ranch itself. She paused. Can you get another head count? An accurate one, done by someone Slade doesn't have access to. I can do it myself. Take Gil, do it over 2 days. Do it at irregular intervals going forward, and weight the feed loads yourself. Every single one. She tapped the ledger. Stop giving whoever's doing this the information they need to calibrate the scheme. Rourke was quiet for a moment. You talk about this like it's your problem to solve. It is my problem, she said partially. You took us in. You sent for the doctor. Whatever this is between us, she gestured vaguely. I'm not going to sit in your house and let Slade take it while I watch. You don't owe me. I know I don't. She said it firmly, not harshly. I'm not doing it because I owe you. I'm doing it because I'm good at this, and you need help, and those are sufficient reasons. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not exactly surprise, but the thing next to surprise, the thing that happens when a person recalculates something. All right, he said. We do the head count starting tomorrow. They were 3 days into the head count cold, methodical work that required both of them and Gil and one of the Pruitt brothers. When Copperidge's opinion of the situation arrived in the form of a delegation. Mara was in the barn when she heard horses in the yard, and she came out into the cold afternoon to find 4 men on horseback, with a 5th Vernon Slade, himself standing on the ground talking to Rourke. The other men had the look of witnesses, or enforcers, or both. Slade had not yet noticed her. Cannot continue to operate under the illusion that your payment schedule is sustainable, Slade was saying. He had a pleasant voice, she'd noticed. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned that pleasantness was a more effective weapon than volume. The 3rd quarter payment is already late, Maddox. I'm prepared to be generous here and extend the deadline by 30 days, but I need a good faith gesture in return. 20 head of cattle, delivered to my yard by Friday. Rourke stood with his arms at his sides and his face utterly still. Payment isn't late. It's due in 9 days. I've reviewed my records and they indicate. Then your records are wrong, Rourke said it flatly. I have the payment schedule. I have it in writing. The date is the 15th. Slade smiled. I'm afraid there was a revision to the standard terms in October that you may have missed. My office sent a notice. I received no notice. These things happen. Slade spread his hands. Look, Rourke, I'm not here to make trouble. I'm here because I want to help you through a difficult time. 20 head? No. Slade's smile didn't waver. I see you have guests at the ranch. His eyes moved for the first time to Mara. I heard you'd taken in a widow and her child. Generous. Perhaps unwise, given your current financial situation, an extra mouth to feed when you're already stretched. Mrs. Ellsworth is working for Iron Willow. Rourke's voice hadn't changed pitch. She's reviewing our accounts and supply contracts. There was a pause, small but real. Slade's eyes moved back to Rourke. Is that so? That's so. Slade looked at Mara again. She met his gaze and did not smile and did not look away. Well, Slade said pleasantly, I hope she finds everything in order. He put his hat back on. I'll send the revised payment notice over again, in case the first was lost. Friday, Maddox. 20 head. It'll go easier than the alternative. He mounted and rode out of the yard with his 4 witnesses, and Mara watched them go and counted to 10 before she said anything. He knows, she said. Rourke turned. What, that I'm looking at the books? Someone told him, or he guessed, but the way he looked at me when you said it. He knows, or he suspects that I found something. Rourke looked back at the gate where Slade's horses had disappeared. How fast can we finish the head count? 2 more days. Do it in 1. He turned toward the barn. Ellis! Dan, get back out there. We're finishing today. Count finished at dusk. Lanterns hung on fence posts in the cold, everyone's breath making clouds in the dark. When Mara tallied the final numbers against the last 4 seasons of records, the discrepancy was substantial 63 head over 18 months, worth roughly $900 at current market rates. Rourke sat with the number for a while. 63, he said. Minimum. Could be more, depending on when the scheme started and whether the early records are complete. That's nearly half a year's mortgage payment. Yes. He put his hands flat on the table. He didn't swear, which surprised her. She'd expected it. Instead, he was very quiet for a very long time. If I'd known sooner, he started. You didn't know sooner because someone worked very hard to make sure you wouldn't. She leaned forward slightly. Don't do that. Don't sit here calculating what would have happened if. We know what we know now, and now is what we have to work with. He looked up. James must have been a lucky man. It came out quiet, almost involuntary, The kind of thing a person says when they're not quite managing the filter between thought and speech. He seemed to realize it immediately, and something shifted in his expression. "I'm sorry," he said. I didn't mean to." "It's all right." She looked at her notes. He was. He was a good man and a careless businessman, and he trusted the wrong people, and I wasn't sharp enough to catch it in time. She paused. "I catch things now." There was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, more like two people standing on either side of something, and both choosing not to cross it yet. "I need to write to Harrington," Rourke said finally. "Do it tonight. Send it with Gil first thing tomorrow, before Slade can—" She stopped. "Before anything else changes." He nodded and went to find paper. Mara sat at the table and looked at the numbers and thought about 63 cattle and $900 and a water source that could strangle an entire valley. And she thought about Toby asleep in the back room and the $12.40. And she made some calculations of her own. She was going to need to be useful in ways that couldn't be ignored. She was going to need to be so clearly, demonstrably valuable to Iron Willow's survival that even if Rourke had wanted to send her away, which she didn't think he did, it would have been a genuinely bad idea. Not for herself. She could find work elsewhere, probably. She was resourceful. For Toby. She wasn't going to let Toby spend another winter like this last one. She wasn't going to watch another doctor reach for his bag and then put it down. She wasn't going to stand in another warm doorway while someone made a reasonable decision to leave her in the cold. She opened the next ledger and kept working. 2 days later, word got to town. She wasn't sure how Gil's trip to send the letter to Harrington, maybe, or one of the Pruett brothers mentioning something at the feed store, or simply the fact that small towns are extraordinarily efficient at knowing things nobody officially told them. But by Thursday morning, there were people in Copper Ridge who knew that Rourke Maddox had a woman at his ranch looking at his books, and that she'd been asking questions about feed deliveries and cattle counts, and that Rourke had sent a letter to a lawyer in Cheyenne. The response came in pieces. First, it was just comments, the kind of comments that get passed along by people who swear they're only mentioning it because they thought you'd want to know. The Pruett brothers heard them at the feed store. Widow making herself comfortable at the Maddox place. Man like Rourke ought to be careful who he lets look at his private accounts. Might be she's angling for more than a job. Ellis told Mara because he was 22 and didn't have the instinct yet to know when not to. "I know," she said. "Let it go." "But they're not even." "Ellis." She looked at him. "I've been talked about in worse ways by people who knew me far longer." "Let it go." She told Rourke that evening. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to her deliver the summary, and then he said, "I know. Kellerman mentioned it when I stopped by this afternoon." And I told him that you were the best thing that had happened to this ranch's books in 3 years, and that anyone who had a problem with your presence was welcome to come say so to my face." He turned to go back to the main room. "Nobody's come yet." Mara looked at his back. "That's not exactly a diplomatic answer." "No," he agreed. "Slade is going to use it. He's going to tell people that you're compromised, that there's a personal angle, that you're not thinking clearly. Let him." He stopped in the doorway but didn't turn around. "Mara, I've spent 3 years being careful and measured and diplomatic in this valley, and I'm still losing cattle I can't account for and getting phony payment notices. Maybe careful isn't working." She didn't have an answer for that. "The head count and the invoice records are ready," she said instead. "I can have a full summary written up by tomorrow. Something a lawyer could work with." "Good," he looked over his shoulder. "And Mara," he paused, "don't let what they're saying push you into leaving before this is finished." "I wasn't planning to leave, all right. I meant what I said. About not being a charity case. I know you did." And for the first time since she'd arrived, something that was almost a smile moved across his face, brief and crooked and clearly unpracticed. "I'm starting to think it's actually true." He went to the main room. Mara went back to her notes. It was on Friday, 9 days before the actual payment deadline, that Slade made his next move. He came to town. Not to the ranch this time, to the main street of Copper Ridge, specifically to the saloon that also served as the informal social hall for the valley's ranchers. He bought a round for the house, which cost him almost nothing, and bought him a room full of attention, and he talked about Iron Willow Ranch. He talked about how concerned he was, about how a man like Rourke, a good man, a hard-working man, had let himself be taken in by a woman none of them knew, a widow from nowhere with a sick child and a story about accounting skills, and how sometimes good men made poor decisions when their judgment was clouded by. He paused, found the right word, sympathy. He said that he'd been told this woman had been asking questions around town about local ranchers' finances, private financial information, that she'd been looking at multiple sets of books, drawing connections, perhaps sharing information between ranches that was never meant to leave those ranches. He said he certainly wasn't accusing anyone of anything, but perhaps the valley's ranchers ought to consider what it meant that a stranger had appeared at precisely the moment when several of them were experiencing financial difficulties, and had immediately positioned herself at the center of their private accounts. He said it pleasantly, with concern in his voice. By Friday evening, 2 of Rourke's neighboring ranchers had sent messages asking him to hold off on any joint discussion of accounts until they could think things through. Mara heard about it from Rourke's expression when he came in that night. "How bad?" she asked. Kellerman's wavering. "Hatch won't talk to me." He sat down heavily. "He made it sound like you're some kind of I don't even know financial spy." She was quiet for a moment. She'd known something like this was coming. She'd known it because it was what she would have done. In Slade's position attack, the credibility of the person doing the accounting before the accounting could do any damage. "He's scared," she said. "That's why he moved fast." "I know he's scared. It doesn't change what the ranchers are thinking." "No." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "What are you thinking?" He looked at her directly. "I'm thinking that a man just publicly implied that you're some kind of grifter in front of every rancher in this valley, and that my defense of you is going to be taken as confirmation of his insinuation. And that Kellerman, who has lost as much as I have from this scheme, is going to choose Slade's version of the story, because it's easier than accepting that he was robbed systematically for 18 months. So what are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then, tomorrow there's a delivery from the feed store. Public delivery, yard will be visible from the road. I'm going to weigh every load on the public scale, record the measurements, and post them on the board at the general store." He paused. "And I'm going to do it with you standing next to me." Mara looked at him. "That's going to make things worse before it makes things better." "Probably. Slade will escalate, yes. People are going to say things. About both of us. Let them. Rourke, Mara." He leaned forward slightly. "Mara and Toby are under my protection. That's what I told Kellerman. That's what I told the Pruetts. That's what I'll post on the board at the general store if I have to." His voice was steady, almost unreasonably steady, the voice of someone who has worked something out and is done revising. "Anyone who wants to make something of that is welcome to come find me." Studied him. She'd been careful, since arriving at Iron Willow, to maintain a professional distance, not cold, just clear. "This is a business arrangement. I am useful to you. You are providing shelter. Those are the terms." She'd maintained that framing because it made sense and because it protected her from the specific vulnerability of needing something she wasn't sure would last. But sitting here watching this particular man refused to back down from a position that was costing him the goodwill of his neighbors on behalf of a woman he'd known for less than a week. That framing was getting harder to hold. "It might not work," she said, "even with the delivery weights. Even if we prove the invoices were fraudulent. Slade has lawyers, he has relationships, he has—" "I know." He picked up his coffee. "We try anyway." She nodded. "Then I'll be there tomorrow. For the delivery." She was. She stood in the yard in the cold while the feed wagon came through the gate, and she watched Rourke and Gill move each load to the public scale. And she wrote down every number in a ledger that was increasingly becoming the most important document in Copper Ridge. The delivery driver, a young man who clearly hadn't expected an audience, got flustered and protested that he just drove the wagon. And Mara told him gently that she knew that, and this wasn't about him, and kept writing. 2 riders passed on the road and slowed to watch. Rourke posted the weights that afternoon. He wrote them out in his own hand, compared them to the invoice amounts, and tacked the sheet to the board at the general store without commentary. The discrepancy was 42%. He didn't say anything about it. Just tacked it up and walked away. He let the numbers do the talking, because that was what Mara had taught him. Numbers couldn't be charmed or intimidated or paid off. They just sat there and told you what happened. That evening, one of the Pruett brothers came back from town with news. There were 3 ranchers who hadn't been at Slade's saloon gathering on Friday, and who had seen the posting, and who were now quietly asking around about whether anyone else had problems with their feed deliveries. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even close to victory. But it was a crack in the wall. Mara sat at the kitchen table after Toby was asleep and wrote out a second summary of the Iron Willow evidence cleaner than the first, structured the way a lawyer would need it. And she thought about those 3 ranchers asking questions. And she thought about the 42% discrepancy posted on the board at the general store. And she thought about a water source that could strangle an entire valley. She thought about what Slade was going to do next. Because he was going to do something. A man who had spent 2 years building this system was not going to watch it crack without responding. He was going to come at Iron Willow hard, and he was going to come soon, and she needed to be ready. Outside, the wind had picked up, the kind of wind that preceded serious weather. Mara looked up from her papers and listened to it for a moment, the way it pressed against the walls of the ranch house, testing seams, finding the places where the cold could get in. She went back to her writing. The weather had been building for 3 days. Mara knew it the way she'd learned to know Wyoming weather, not by looking at the sky, which lied constantly out here, but by the way the animals behaved. Rourke's horses were restless in their stalls, pacing and knocking against the wood. The cattle in the north pasture had been bunching since morning, pressing toward the center of the herd in that instinctive geometry of creatures that know something cold is coming. Even Toby had been quieter than usual, which was either the weather or the fact that 3-year-olds absorbed the moods of the adults around them like sponges, and the adults around him had been tense for days. The posting at the general store had done something. Not everything, not even close to everything, but something. 2 more ranchers had come to Rourke quietly, not publicly, not in any way that Slade could see and respond to, but they'd come. A man named Osterfeld, who ran a small operation east of the creek, had shown up one evening just before dark, hat in hand, and asked if he could talk. Rourke had brought him inside, and Mara had made coffee, and Osterfeld had sat at the kitchen table with the particular embarrassment of a man who was about to admit he was fooled. "My feed invoices," he'd said. "I always thought they were high. I thought I was just bad at estimating." Mara had looked at his records for an hour, found the same methodology, almost exactly same timing, same calibration, same patient, invisible bleeding. She'd shown it to Osterfeld, walked him through each discrepancy, watched his face move through the stages of understanding. How long, he'd asked. At least 2 years, she'd told him. Possibly longer if your older records show the same pattern. He'd driven home in the dark without saying much. But the next day, he'd sent his wife over with a jar of preserves and a note that said simply, "Tell me what you need." It wasn't enough yet. Mara knew that. They needed more ranchers. They needed the summary documents completed. And they needed word back from Harrington in Cheyenne, which hadn't come yet, and whose absence was starting to press on her in ways she was trying not to show. What they didn't need was a blizzard. But the blizzard came anyway. It started late afternoon first, just wind. The kind that finds every gap in your clothing, no matter how carefully you dressed. And then snow. And then, within 2 hours, the kind of conditions where you could lose a man 20 feet from the barn if he didn't know exactly where he was going. Temperature dropped so fast you could almost hear it, the cold snapping down like something mechanical rather than natural. Rourke had gotten the horses in before it hit. The cattle in the south pasture were in reasonable shape. That pasture had a natural windbreak along its eastern edge, a long spine of rock that cut the worst of the wind. The north pasture was different. That was where the younger stock grazed. 40 head of cattle that had less fat on them, less experience of Wyoming winters, and no natural shelter to speak of. By 8 in the evening, Rourke was standing at the front window with a lamp, watching the weather, and his expression was the kind that Mara had learned to read over the past 2 weeks. Not panic. Nothing so useful as panic, but a very controlled, very contained dread. "The north fence," he said. "What about it?" "The whole north section has been showing wear. I've been meaning to repair it since October, but we've been He stopped. Been a busy autumn. Mara understood what he wasn't saying. They'd been so occupied with the accounts, the head counts, with building the legal case, that routine maintenance had slipped. The fence fails in this, he said. The cattle will drift. In whiteout conditions, they drift until they find something to stop them. Sometimes that's a shelter. Sometimes it's a ravine. She'd heard about that cattle walking off the edge of drops they couldn't see in blinding snow, the whole herd following each other, because in a whiteout, there's nothing else to follow. Then we need to check the fence, she said. He looked at her. It's bad out there. I know what it is out there. She was already reaching for her coat. Who do you have? Ellis and Dan are in the bunkhouse. Gills, get them up, all three. She was pulling on her boots. What's our biggest concern, the fence failing, or finding the cattle if they've already drifted? If they've already drifted, we can't find them tonight. That's the truth of it. He was reaching for his own coat now. We need the fence to hold. Then we ride the fence line and reinforce what we can. She looked up. Do you have wire? Post nails? In the equipment shed. Get them. He didn't question her giving instructions in his own house, which she noticed and filed away for later. He went to the equipment shed and she went to wake the Pruitt brothers and found that Gil was already up. The old foreman apparently slept like a cat, always half alert, and by the time Rourke came back with the wire and nails, they had 4 horses saddled and 5 people in the yard, squinting into the dark and the horizontal snow. Ride in pairs, Rourke said. Nobody goes anywhere alone. If you lose each other, head back to the barn and wait. He looked at Mara. You should stay with the boy. Toby is asleep and Gil is staying at the barn. He'll hear him. She took the wire from Rourke's hands. Show me where the weakest sections are. He looked at her for one more moment, and then he turned his horse north. The ride to the north fence took twice as long as it should have. The wind was coming in from the northwest, full on and deliberate, and her horse had to lean into it to make progress. She could barely see Rourke's lamp ahead of her, just a smear of yellow in the white dark, and she kept her eyes fixed on it, with the focused concentration of someone who knows that if they lose that light, they lose their orientation entirely. They hit the fence line and immediately found the first problem. 3 posts down on the eastern section had given way. Not broken, but pulled, she realized when Rourke brought his lamp close. Pulled out of the frozen ground deliberately, leaving the wire sagging to the surface. She dropped from her horse and grabbed the wire and felt something hard and cold that wasn't ice. Cut, clean diagonal wire cutters, she looked up. Rourke was looking at it too, and his face in the lamplight was something she hadn't seen from him before, a kind of white, contained fury, the face of a man who has had the worst thing confirmed. This wasn't the weather, she said. No. He took the wire from her hands, examining the cut. This was tonight. This was recent. The wire ends aren't oxidized from the cold yet, which means they were here in the last few hours. She looked out into the dark. Rourke, the cattle. He was already standing up. Ellis! The younger Pruitt brother materialized out of the snow. Rourke gave him rapid instructions: ride the eastern fence line, look for more cuts. Don't touch anything, just note and report. And Ellis disappeared back into the white. They'll have opened a section wide enough to let the herd through, Mara said. She was thinking fast, the way she thought through accounting problems. What's the goal? What's the method? What's the most efficient path to the outcome? They don't want to find the cattle later, they want them gone. Lost in the storm or pushed somewhere specific. The North Ravine, Rourke said, came out flat and hollow. It's 3 miles north of here. The herd drifts north in this. Then we don't chase them north. She grabbed his arm. Think, 100 cattle in a whiteout. You can't chase them. You can't push them. You can't do anything but follow behind them until you go over the edge with them. Then what? You draw them. She was already turning back toward the barn in her mind, running the geometry of the ranch the way she'd memorized it from the site maps and the supply ledgers. The South Hay enclosure, the one that's been sitting empty since October. It's been abandoned for 2 seasons. The structure's not. It doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be a destination. Cattle move toward shelter and food in bad weather. If we open the south enclosure and get hay in there and light-protected lanterns along a corridor between here and there, she stopped. You have hay in the equipment barn, about 2 tons. And the bell mare, the roan. She leads, the herd follows her. You said that yourself last week. He was staring at her. It's a quarter-mile of corridor, she said. We can do it. But we need to start now, before they've drifted too far north. A long, cold second, wind screaming, snow in her eyes. All right, he said. You take Dan and set up the corridor. I'll ride north and find the herd. Rourke, I know this land in the dark. Dan doesn't. He was already mounted. Set up the corridor. Get the mare ready. I'll find them and push them south enough that they'll take the lead when she goes. He rode north into the dark before she could say anything else. Mara rode back to the barn at a pace that her horse was clearly unhappy about and that she didn't have time to apologize for. Gil had heard them come back and was already in the doorway. What do you need, he said. She told him. Gil was a man who processed information efficiently and without visible drama. He listened, nodded once, and started moving. Dan Pruett was younger and more emotional, and said several things under his breath that were probably not appropriate for mixed company, but he also started moving, which was what mattered. They worked in the barn for 20 minutes getting hay loaded onto the flatbed sled, hitching the 2 draft horses to it, lighting 6 lanterns and rigging them in caged enclosures that would protect the flame from the wind. Mara worked alongside Dan and didn't waste words. Her hands were numb inside her gloves by the time they were done, but she'd been working with numb hands for years, and she'd learned that the hands still worked fine. You just couldn't feel them doing it. Corridor, she told Dan. We go from the south pasture gate north along the fence line as far as we can manage. Lanterns every 100 feet, hay scattered between them. The light won't carry far in this, but it doesn't have to carry far. It just has to be visible to a herd that's looking for something to follow. And if the boss can't push them south enough, then we come back for the horses and we wait for morning and we see what's left. She said it without inflection. But let's do what we can first. They went out. Setting up the corridor in a Wyoming blizzard was not a thing she would ever want to do again. The wind fought them for every lantern. Twice the flame guttered and died despite the cage, and she had cupped the match with her whole body to relight it. The hay scattered wrong, the wind pushing it into drifts against the fence instead of leaving it accessible on the path, and she and Dan had to go back along the line twice to redistribute it. Her feet had gone past the point of numbness into something that was either pain or the absence of pain. She couldn't quite tell. But the lanterns held. Sick yellow smears of light in the dark, strung along the fence line like improbable stars, pointing south toward the enclosure where Gil had the doors open and fresh hay spread and, most importantly, Rourke's roan bell mare standing patient and enormous and completely unbothered by the storm. Mara stood at the north end of the corridor and listened. Wind, snow, the creak of the fence, then something else. A low sound, spread out and directionless at first, and then with more shape, the sound of a large number of hooves on frozen ground. And underneath that, the ball of cattle that are cold and lost and moving because stopping doesn't feel safe. They're coming, Dan said. Not fast enough, she said. They need to see the first lantern. She waited. The sound got louder and then started to diffuse. The herd was spreading. She could hear it, the edges drifting away from the center in the way that spooked cattle do in bad visibility. Come on, she said quietly. Not to anyone in particular. And then out of the dark a horse materialized. Rourke's horse. Moving at a careful, deliberate pace. Not panicked, guided. And behind it, the first shapes of cattle, heads down, following the heat and mass of the horse in front of them. Rourke had found them. He'd gotten ahead of the herd somehow. She could see him now, riding the dark roan with one hand on the reins and one arm extended, keeping the nearest animals pointed south, his body turned sideways in the saddle to watch the herd behind him. He looked like he'd been through something. His hat was gone, his coat was dark with snow, and when he passed the first lantern, she saw that he was favoring his right side. Corridors set, she called to him. Give them to the mare. He nodded and pulled off to the side, letting the herd's momentum carry them past him, and the lead animals tasting hay on the air now. Seeing the next lantern, ahead started moving with more purpose. Mara stepped back against the fence and let them pass. Hundreds of pounds of panicked cattle moving through the narrow space between the lanterns, close enough that she felt the heat of them and the displaced air. Counted as they passed. She was at 38 when she realized Rourke hadn't come through yet. She waited. 39:40. The tail of the herd. 41. No Rourke. She grabbed the nearest lantern and walked north along the fence line, back the way the herd had come. The cattle had churned the snow into something impossible to read, and the wind was already filling in the hoofprints. And she walked and held the lantern up and called his name into the dark. Nothing. Then a shape on the ground. She ran. He was down in the snow about 40 yards north of the corridor. Not unconscious, she could see him moving, trying to get up, but his horse was gone and he was moving wrong. One arm pressed against his side. One leg that wouldn't cooperate the way he needed it to. She dropped to her knees beside him. What happened? Horse spooked. He got the words out through his teeth. Edge of the herd. One of the animals came out of the dark sideways. Full speeds hit us broadside. Horse went one way, I went the other. Can you stand? Probably. Give me a... She put her arm under his and he stood up. Not smoothly. His face in the lantern light was gray and set, and when she put her hand against his ribs, he made a sound that he clearly hadn't intended to make. Something's cracked, she said. It'll hold. He found his footing and straightened up very carefully. Cattle in the corridor. Dan's with them. They're heading for the enclosure. She kept her arm under his. Can you walk? I can walk. He could walk, technically. It was not a comfortable process, and it was not fast, and she did not let go of him the entire way back, which he didn't argue about, which told her more about how much pain he was in than anything else would have. They came through the gate, and Dan saw them and came running, and between the two of them, they got Rourke into the barn. Gil appeared from somewhere and took one look and went to heat water. Rourke sat down on a hay bale and breathed for a while. 41 head, Mara said. She was still counting in her head. We need to get a full count when this clears, but I think we got most of them. He nodded, his eyes were closed. I need to look at your ribs. He opened his eyes. Mara, I've bound cracked ribs before. Let me look. He didn't have the energy to argue. She unwound his coat carefully, and he sat still while she worked through it, and when she pressed along his side, she found two places that gave too much. He was correct that it would hold cracked ribs hurt terribly, but they weren't the crisis. Not tonight. Not unless they'd punctured something. His breathing sounded clean. She tore strips from the spare cloth Gil brought and bound his ribs with the efficiency of someone who has dealt with injured men before. Tighter than comfort would allow, but solid enough to keep things stable. You need to not be on a horse for several days, she said. I need to... Several days. She tied off the binding. Gil and the Pruetts can manage the stock. You have specific and important work to do that requires you to be sitting at a desk, and cracked ribs do not prevent that. He looked at her. Is that right? Yes. She helped him get his coat back on. We need to document the fence cuts. Tonight, before anyone can claim it was weather damage. I need you to write a statement in your own hand, what you found, what condition the wire was in, the direction of the cuts, everything you observed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. She went back out to get Dan to ride the fence line with her. Rourke couldn't, and Gil needed to stay with the cattle, and someone needed to document the damage before the storm covered it completely. Dan was 22 and had been running on adrenaline since she'd woken him up 2 hours ago, but he was young and he could manage another hour. They rode the northern fence in the last hours of the blizzard, Mara with a lantern and a notebook, Dan with a second lantern, and what she was fairly certain was a prayer on his lips every time the wind gusted. She documented each cut section. There were 4 of them, spread along a 100-yard stretch, deliberate and evenly spaced, and she noted the condition of each cut end and the positioning of the pulled posts. It was when they reached the 4th cut section, at the far eastern end of the fence line, that she found something else. Something had been dropped in the snow near the post. Caught on the lower wire, held there by the wind, a ledger. Small leather-bound, the kind a man carries in a coat pocket. She reached over from her horse and pulled it free of the wire. The initials on the cover were VS. Her heart moved in a specific way, not fast but hard, like something solid dropping into place. She opened it. It was accounts. Not Slade's personal household accounts, operations accounts. And not Iron Willow operations. Something bigger. Dates, amounts, initials she didn't recognize yet, but the structure was familiar. painfully familiar. The same patient methodology she'd found in Rourke's books, replicated here in Slade's own handwriting, applied to 6, 7, 8 different properties. Names she recognized: Kellerman, Hatch, Osterfeld, and amounts that were considerably larger than what had appeared in the manipulated invoices. The difference between what Slade had been extracting and what he'd been showing in his official accounts. This wasn't just the evidence of what he'd done to Iron Willow. This was the record of everything. She stared at the ledger for a moment, snow falling on the open page, and understood that she was holding the thing that could end Vernon Slade. "What is that?" Dan said. "Evidence," she said. She closed it carefully and tucked it inside her coat against her body where it would stay dry. "Ride, we need to get back." She found Rourke at the kitchen table, as she'd left him, writing his statement about the fence in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who knows what he writes might matter legally. He looked up when she came through the door. She set the ledger on the table in front of him. He looked at it, at the initials, then at her. "Where?" "Caught on the eastern fence section. One of Slade's men dropped it in the dark." She sat down across from him. "I need you to understand what this is before I open it again. This is not just evidence about Iron Willow. This is Slade's operational record for every property he's been working. In his own handwriting, with his initials on the cover." Rourke's hand was on the ledger. He hadn't opened it yet. "How many properties?" "At least 8 that I could see on a quick scan. I need to go through it properly. But Rourke Kellerman is in there. Hatch, Osterfeld. And the amounts don't match his official records, which means this isn't just fraud. It's systematic falsification of Tot. He could claim it's not his. His initials are embossed on the cover. I'd guess the handwriting will match documents he signed publicly. And the methodology she tapped the cover. The methodology is identical to what I found in your books. If a lawyer looks at this alongside your records and the other ranchers' records, the pattern is unmistakable." Rourke opened the ledger. He read for a while. She watched his face change as he read, not dramatically, not with the kind of visible emotion that makes people comfortable, but in small specific ways. Tightening around the eyes, a muscle in his jaw. His breathing, which was already careful because of the ribs, getting slightly more controlled, which she'd learned meant he was working to keep something contained. Closed it. "He had men cutting my fence tonight," he said. "In a blizzard. While my cattle were in the north pasture." "Yes. Not to steal them this time, to lose them." "He's moving faster." The feed weight posting scared him. The letter to Harrington scared him. She leaned forward. "He's trying to create a crisis large enough that you can't recover. If you lose 40 head in a storm that might plausibly be blamed on weather, the mortgage payment fails, and he steps in with the foreclosure and a sympathetic face, and nobody can prove it wasn't just bad luck." She looked at the ledger. Except that one of his men dropped that in the snow. Rourke sat back. He winced the ribs, and then settled into the pain with the resigned acceptance of a man who knows it's going to be there for a while, regardless. "I need you to be honest with me," he said. "How solid is this? If we take this to Harrington, if we stand in front of a judge with this, how solid is it?" She didn't answer immediately. She thought about it the way she'd learned to think about financial documents. Not what she wanted them to say, what they actually said. "It's solid enough to force a real inquiry," she said. "It may not be enough on its own to convict him of anything. But combined with your records, Kellerman's records, Osterfeld's records, and the statements of ranchers who are willing to speak publicly, it changes the mathematics entirely." She paused. "He's been operating on the assumption that no individual rancher has enough evidence to matter. This ledger connects all of them. It makes the pattern visible in a single document in his own hand. He'll say it's fabricated. Then we need witnesses." She met his eyes. "We need the ranchers to come forward. Publicly. Not quietly. Not through intermediaries. They need to stand up in front of the valley and say what happened to them. Some of them won't. Some of them will." She thought about the jar of preserves from Osterfeld's wife. "Tell me what you need. People are braver than you think when they're not alone." Rourke looked at the ledger for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Mara." He said her name like he was placing it carefully. "If this goes wrong, if Slade has a judge, or the inquiry gets buried, or the ranchers back out, He'll come for Iron Willow with everything he has. You understand that? Yes. And I'm still. She said it without hesitation. I'm not doing this because I'm brave. I'm doing it because I'm angry, and because I'm good at this, and because I have a 3-year-old son who is going to grow up watching how adults behave when something difficult needs doing. Rourke was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the blizzard was finally loosening. The wind had dropped to something merely bitter rather than violent. And through the kitchen window, Mara could see the sky was beginning to separate from the land, the black of it distinguishable from the white. In the morning, Rourke said, I want to ride to Kellerman myself. Not send a message. Go myself. You can't ride with cracked ribs. Then I'll drive the wagon. He looked at the ledger. He needs to see this. He needs to see it and know that we have it and know what it means. Because if Kellerman comes forward, if he stands up in front of this valley and says what Slade did to him, others will follow. And if he doesn't, Rourke's jaw set. Then we go without him. She nodded. She took the ledger and her notebook and sat at the table for the next 2 hours, working through Slade's records with the same systematic patience she'd applied to Rourke's cross-referencing, marking discrepancies, building a map of the scheme from the inside out. Rourke fell asleep in his chair, which she'd expected pain and adrenaline, and a hard night had a way of collecting their debt all at once, and she let him sleep and kept working. Toby appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point before dawn, hair wild, dragging the edge of his blanket. Mama, right here, she said quietly. He looked at Rourke asleep in the chair. He sick? He got hurt a little. He'll be fine. Toby padded across the kitchen and stood next to Rourke's chair and studied him with the intent, unsentimental assessment of a small child examining something they've decided matters. Then he went back to his room and came back with his blanket and, carefully, with great seriousness, laid it across Rourke's lap. Rourke didn't wake up. Toby went back to bed. Mara sat in the lamplight with Vernon Slade's ledger and let the scene settle into the part of herself where she kept things she wasn't ready to look at yet, and she added it to the small and growing collection. Then she turned the next page and kept reading. Kellerman cried. Not dramatically, not the way a man cries in a story when the moment calls for it. He cried the way real men cry when they've been holding something too long, and it finally gets too heavy, quietly, and with obvious anger at himself for doing it. His face turned toward the window of his kitchen, while Rourke sat across the table and didn't say anything and let it happen. Mara waited in the wagon outside. It had been Rourke's idea. He'd said Kellerman would talk more honestly without a stranger in the room, and she'd agreed, and she'd sat in the cold with Toby asleep across her lap and a lap robe pulled over both of them, and she'd waited. Rourke had been inside for 40 minutes when Kellerman came out first. He was a broad, weathered man in his 50s, the kind of face that had been outdoors for 30 years and looked it, not unhandsome, just permanent, like something carved rather than grown. He stood on his porch and looked at Mara in the wagon for a moment. You're the one who found the ledger, he said. The ledger found itself, she said. I just picked it up. He almost smiled. Almost. Rourke says you went through my records without even meeting me. I went through the pattern. Your name was in the structure. I didn't look at anything private that wasn't relevant. He was quiet for a moment. Then 2 years. I've been blaming myself for 2 years. Thought I was losing my mind. Thought I'd gotten old and stupid and couldn't run a ranch anymore. He stopped. My wife thought so too. She didn't say it, but I could tell. Mara didn't offer comfort. He wasn't asking for it. Now you know you're not stupid. Now I know I was robbed. He said it plainly, without drama, like naming a weather condition. There's a difference. Rourke came out behind him, moving carefully. He'd driven the wagon because she'd refused to let him ride, and even the wagon's jostling on frozen roads had cost him. She could tell from the set of his jaw. He came down the porch steps and stopped at the bottom. Well, Mara said. He's in, Rourke said. She looked at Kellerman. I'm in, Kellerman confirmed. He didn't sound happy about it. He sounded like a man who has made a decision he knows is right and expensive simultaneously. You need from me your records, she said. The feed invoices, the cattle counts, the payment correspondence with Slade's office. Everything you have going back 3 years if possible. I need to build a complete account that parallels what I've done with Iron Willow's books. How long will that take? Give me 2 days with your ledgers. I'll send word when I have something a lawyer can use. Kellerman looked at Rourke. Is Harrington coming? I sent a second letter yesterday, Rourke said. Told him what we found. He should be here within the week. Slade's going to find out. Slade already suspects, Mara said. The fence cutting wasn't random. He knows we're building something. The question is whether we can build it faster than he can dismantle it. Kellerman looked at her for a long moment. You're not from here. No. You came to this valley 3 weeks ago with a sick child and nothing else. That's accurate. He shook his head slowly. And somehow you're the one who's going to save it. He said it without irony, without complaint, just the observation of a man recalibrating his understanding of how things work. All right, come tomorrow. I'll have everything pulled out. They drove back to Iron Willow in the thin January sunlight, the snow bright and blinding on either side of the road. Toby awake now and asking whether Kellerman had horses and whether they were bigger than Rourke's horses and whether any horse was bigger than any other horse, or were they all the same. Rourke, to her surprise, engaged with this seriously. He explained that draft horses were generally larger than quarter horses, and that the biggest horses he'd personally seen were in a logging operation near the Montana border, and that Toby might one day see a Clydesdale if he was patient. Toby absorbed this. How patient? Pretty patient. Toby considered the economics of patience versus Clydesdales. Okay, he decided. Mara watched the road and didn't say what she was thinking, which was that the week ahead of them was going to be the hardest stretch yet, and that they were doing it with cracked ribs and incomplete evidence, and a valley full of people who were only just beginning to understand they'd been robbed, and that Slade had resources and relationships and 2 years of maneuvering advantage, and that the margin for error was extremely small. Kept it to herself. Toby didn't need to hear it, and Rourke already knew it. The letter from Harrington arrived 2 days later. It was not as long as she'd hoped, but what it contained was enough. He'd reviewed the summary she'd sent, she'd written it herself, and Rourke had sent it with the second message. And he believed there was sufficient basis for a formal complaint of fraud to the county registrar, contingent on documentation from multiple property owners and physical evidence linking the scheme to a single orchestrating party. He was coming to Copper Ridge. He'd arrive Thursday. Thursday was 4 days away. Mara spent those 4 days at Kellerman's kitchen table, and her own, cross-referencing 2 sets of books against Slade's operational ledger, building the document that Harrington would need to walk into the registrar's office and make the case stick. She worked in the mornings and evenings and most of the nights, sleeping in 4-hour stretches, letting Toby wake her up and then going back to the numbers. Rourke watched this with a particular expression she'd started to recognize. Not worry exactly, more the look of a man who wants to help and can't find the precise entry point. He brought coffee. He kept Toby occupied with barn chores and horse explanations and fence inspection, which Toby participated in with a seriousness that was entirely out of proportion to his size. On the second evening, he came in and set a coffee cup by her elbow and stood there for a moment. Eat something, he said. I will. You said that 3 hours ago. I was closer to a breakthrough 3 hours ago. He went and got a plate and set it down next to the coffee. She ate without looking up, reading while she chewed, which she knew was not elegant and didn't particularly care. Osterfeld's coming tomorrow, Rourke said. And there are 2 more brothers named Calloway. They run cattle east of the creek. Gil heard they've been having the same feed issues. Can you get them to talk? I can try. They're stubborn. Old family, been in the valley since the territory days. They don't like outsiders. Then go without me. She turned a page. You know them. I don't. Sometimes the most useful thing I can do is not be in the room. He was quiet for a moment. That's not something most people know about themselves. I've had to learn what I'm useful for and what I'm not. It's a practical skill. He sat down across from her, which he didn't usually do when she was working. He generally gave her space, which she'd appreciated. She looked up. What? She said. Nothing. He was looking at his coffee. I was just thinking about Thursday, when Harrington gets here. And? Slade's going to find out Harrington is here within about 4 hours of him arriving. Small town. The man can't eat lunch without the whole valley knowing about it. I know. So Slade's going to do something before we can get the filing completed. He's going to try to get ahead of it. Yes, she set her pencil down. What would you do if you were him? Rourke thought about it. He was good at this better than she'd initially expected, the kind of mind that moved methodically rather than quickly, but didn't miss things. I'd call the debts, all of them. Every rancher I had leverage on, I'd call the debt due immediately. Force a crisis that the lawyer has to respond to before he can file anything proactive. That's what I think too. She looked at her pages. Which means we need to have the filing ready before Harrington arrives. He needs to walk in the door Thursday morning and be ready to go directly to the registrar. Can you have it ready? She calculated. It was a real calculation, not optimism, not reassurance, actual hours of work against hours available. If Osterfeld's records are clean and the Callaways come in by tomorrow night. Yes. And if they don't, we file with what we have, and we use the Slade ledger as the centerpiece, and we trust that the pattern is visible enough to justify an inquiry even without complete documentation from every property. She looked at him. It won't be perfect. A formal fraud conviction could take months, maybe longer. But an inquiry from the county registrar, a public official, documented inquiry, changes the situation on the ground immediately. It stops Slade from foreclosing while the question's open. It gives the other ranchers standing to contest their payment demands. Buys time. Time for what? Time for people to stop being afraid. She picked up her pencil. That's what this has always been about, really. Slade doesn't have power because he's strong. He has power because everyone is isolated and afraid and convinced they're the only one who failed. The moment they see they're not alone, the whole thing shifts. The whole thing shifts, she confirmed. She went back to work. Osterfeld came the next morning. The Callaway brothers, Ned and Frank, both in their 60s, both with the same set to their jaw that suggested they'd been making the same expression since approximately 1000. 840 arrived in the afternoon, sat at the kitchen table, looked at what Mara put in front of them for about 20 minutes, and then Ned said, very quietly, "That's my handwriting on that invoice. I signed it. I thought I was signing for what I received." "You were signing for what they told you was delivered," Mara said. "The load was short." "I know the load was short," Ned said. "I just thought it was me. I thought I was miscounting." He looked at his brother. Frank was looking at the table. 4 years we've been miscounting." "You haven't," Mara said. Frank Callaway looked up. He had the eyes of a man who kept a lot behind them. "What do you need from us?" "Your signature on a statement describing your losses and the discrepancies in your records. And your willingness to say so publicly if it comes to that." Frank looked at his brother. Some communication passed between them that didn't require words, the kind that develops over decades of working alongside someone in all weather. "We're in," Frank said. She worked through the night again. Rourke found her at 3 in the morning and didn't say anything, just built the fire up higher without asking, and went back to his room. Gil appeared at 5 with coffee that was strong enough to constitute a threat and left it without comment. By dawn on Thursday, Mara had a document that was 51 pages long. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She felt the way she felt after finishing a particularly difficult set of accounts, satisfied in a quiet, technical way, and also extremely tired, and also aware that finishing the document was not the same as winning anything. Harrington arrived at Iron Willow at 9:30 in the morning. He was not what she'd expected. She'd built a mental picture distinguished, silver-haired, the kind of lawyer who filled a room. What came through the door was a compact man in his 40s, sharp-faced, with ink stains on his right hand, and the slightly distracted expression of someone who is thinking about 3 things simultaneously. He shook Rourke's hand, looked at Mara with frank assessment, and said, "You're the one who built the document?" "Yes." "How long did it take?" 11 days. He raised an eyebrow. "Professional background?" "I kept freight business accounts for 6 years. And I've had reason to learn how this specific type of fraud is constructed." He absorbed this. "I'd like an hour with the document before we discuss strategy." "Take 2, she said. "I'll make it worth your time." He sat at the kitchen table with her 51 pages and his own notes, and Mara left him to it and went to check on Toby, and stood at the window of the back room for a few minutes, doing absolutely nothing, which felt strange and necessary. Toby was in the yard with Dan Pruitt, apparently attempting to teach the older boy something about the correct way to address a fence post. Dan was crouched down listening to this instruction with an expression of genuine solemnity. She watched them for a moment, and something in her chest loosened very slightly. Then she went back to the kitchen. Harrington looked up when she came in. His expression had changed, not dramatically, but the distracted quality was gone, replaced by something more focused. "The Slade ledger," he said. "Where exactly was it found?" "Caught on the eastern fence wire during the storm. One of his men dropped it. And you have a witness to the finding?" Dan Pruitt, one of Rourke's hands. Harrington nodded slowly. "This is enough for an inquiry. I want to be clear. This alone today is not sufficient for a criminal conviction. Slade has lawyers who will challenge provenance, challenge the interpretation of the methodology, challenge every point of contact. But," he tapped the document, "this is more than sufficient to file a formal complaint with the county registrar, which initiates an inquiry that freezes his ability to foreclose on any of the properties named while the question is open." "What I told Rourke." "You told him right." Harrington closed the document. "I want to file today, this afternoon if possible. Are the other ranchers Kellerman, Osterfeld, the Callaways are they prepared to sign the formal complaint?" "I can have them here by noon." "Then let's do it by noon." She sent Gill for Kellerman and a Pruitt brother for Osterfeld, and Rourke drove himself to the Callaway spread, which she would have argued against except that he'd gotten his coat on before she could form the sentence. And he was back in an hour with both brothers in the wagon bed. They sat at the kitchen table, 5 ranchers, a lawyer, and Mara and Harrington went through the complaint document section by section, and each man signed where his name appeared, and by 11:30 the thing was done. Harrington left for the registrar's office immediately. The ranchers sat at the table for a while after he left. Nobody said much. Ned Callaway refilled his coffee. Kellerman looked out the window at the yard. Osterfeld's knee was bouncing under the table. "What happens now?" Osterfeld asked. "Harrington files," Rourke said. "The registrar has to acknowledge receipt within 48 hours and open a case file. Once the case is open, Slade can't move on any foreclosure action while it's pending." "Slade?" "Slade finds out," Mara said, "and then Slade reacts." They didn't have long to wait. Slade arrived at Iron Willow the next morning. He didn't come alone this time. He came with the county sheriff, a man named Briggs, broad and uncomfortable looking, who rode like a man who knows he's being used as a prop, but has calculated that arguing about it costs more than compliance, and 2 of the men who'd been at the first confrontation, and his lawyer, a thin man from Cheyenne named Waverly, who had the look of someone who'd spent his career making bad things sound technical. They came through the gate at 9:30 and found Rourke in the yard. And they found Mara standing beside him. She'd been inside 10 minutes ago. She'd come out when she heard the horses, because she'd made a decision in the night, not an emotional decision, a strategic one. Slade's power in this valley depended on people staying where he'd put them, and he'd put Mara in the category of someone who could be ignored, and she was done being ignored. Slade took in the situation. His pleasant face arranged itself into concern. "Maddox," he said, "I've heard some troubling things." "I expect you have," Rourke said. "This woman," Slade gestured toward Mara without looking at her directly, "has apparently been making representations to the county registrar's office. Representations involving fraudulent documentation." "The documentation isn't fraudulent," Mara said. Now he looked at her. "I beg your pardon?" "The documentation isn't fraudulent," she said again, at the same volume. "The fraud is in the operational records you've been keeping separately from your official accounts. The ledger with your initials on the cover, with your handwriting throughout, documenting the methodology you've applied to 8 properties in this valley over a period of at least 3 years. Waverly, the lawyer, stepped forward. "Any document of that description would be filed with the county registrar as of yesterday afternoon," Mara said. "Along with the testimony of 5 property owners, the cross-referenced feed invoices from 4 separate suppliers, cattle count discrepancies verified by independent head counts, and the statements of 3 witnesses who can speak to the condition of the fence wire cut on Iron Willow property during the storm." Waverly stopped. Slade's pleasant expression hadn't moved. That was the thing she'd noticed about him from the beginning, The control, the absolute management of surface. He was recalculating behind it. She could see the slight shift in his eyes, but the face stayed arranged. Sheriff Briggs, Slade said, I believe there may be grounds to consider this woman's presence on this property as what? Rourke's voice was quiet. She works for Iron Willow. She's been working for Iron Willow for 3 weeks. She has every right to be here. I understand the arrangement, Slade said, with a specific inflection on the word that was meant to imply something. But given the legal situation, Mara said, is that you have been systematically defrauding ranchers in this valley by manipulating their debt obligations, stealing their cattle through intermediaries, inflating their supply invoices through colluding vendors, and using the resulting financial distress to acquire their properties at foreclosure for a fraction of their value. She said it clearly and without particular heat, the way you state facts that don't require emotion to be true. That's the legal situation. Briggs, on his horse, was looking somewhere between Mara and the middle distance. She had a sense that he was a man who'd told himself this morning that this was a simple property dispute and was now revising that. Waverly was whispering to Slade. Slade listened without any visible reaction and then stepped forward. Maddox, he said, I have come here today to give you one final opportunity to resolve this quietly. The registrar's complaint can be withdrawn. The documentation you've submitted can be reviewed and no doubt explained. I'm prepared to offer a settlement that would allow you to. No. Rourke said it before Slade finished the sentence. Not loudly. Not with any visible anger. Just clearly, the way a man says no when he's said it enough times internally, that the external version is effortless. Whatever you're offering, Rourke said, the answer is no. Slade looked at him for a long moment. You're making a mistake. I've made mistakes before. Rourke looked at the group of men in his yard, the lawyer, the hired hands, the uncomfortable sheriff. Briggs. Is there a warrant? An official action? Something that requires my response right now? Briggs cleared his throat. No official warrant at this. Then I'll ask you to leave my property. Rourke said it without hostility, which was somehow more effective. All of you. You're welcome to come back with official documentation if the registrar's inquiry produces anything that requires my direct response. Until then, Waverly started to say something. Slade put a hand up and stopped him. He looked at Mara one more time, not at Rourke, at Mara. It was a specific look, the kind that says, I know where this came from and I haven't forgotten. She met it and didn't move. They left. The yard was quiet for a moment after the gate closed. Rourke let out a long breath, carefully, because of the ribs. That went better than I expected, he said. That was the opening, Mara said. Not the fight. I know. She turned and went back inside, because Toby had been in the front room during all of this, and she needed to check on him, and also because her hands were shaking very slightly, and she'd rather they did that indoors. Toby was fine. He was on the floor with a wooden horse Gil had carved him, making it walk across the floorboards with intense concentration. He looked up when she came in. Was that the bad man? He asked. Crouched down. What makes you say that? Because Rourke had his serious face. Toby moved the wooden horse thoughtfully. He only has that face for the fence and the bad man. Mara sat on the floor beside him. Yes, that was the bad man. Is he going to go away? She watched him walk the horse across the floor. We're working on it. Okay, he seemed satisfied. He offered her the horse. You can make it walk if you want. She took the horse. She made it walk. She sat on the floor of Iron Willow Ranch with her son and walked a wooden horse across the floorboards and let her hands stop shaking. The inquiry moved faster than she'd expected and more publicly. Harrington was a different kind of lawyer than she'd imagined. Not the courtroom kind, but the documentation kind who understood that the most effective way to fight a man with political relationships was to make the documentation so clear and so public that the political relationships became a liability rather than an asset. He filed everything publicly. He made sure copies went to the territorial newspaper correspondent who happened to be passing through Copper Ridge on his way to cover a mining story in the next county. He was not subtle about any of this, which initially alarmed Rourke, and which Mara recognized as exactly correct. Sunlight, she told Rourke, that's the only thing that actually works. The correspondent, a young man named Garrett, eager and slightly disheveled, showed up at Iron Willow 2 days after the filing and asked to speak with whoever had compiled the evidence. Rourke brought him to Mara. She talked to him for 2 hours. She went through the methodology, the documentation, the pattern across properties, the specific evidence in Slade's ledger. She was precise and unemotional, and she answered every question he asked and offered nothing that wasn't factual. When he asked about her personal situation, how she'd come to be at Iron Willow, what her connection to the case was, she gave him the minimal version. She was the ranch's accounts manager. She'd identified the irregularities in the course of reviewing the books. "You weren't hired as accounts manager when this started," Garrett said carefully. "No," she said. "I was hired after I identified the irregularities." He looked at her. He was young but not naive, Mrs. Ellsworth. "The story here, the human element. The human element is that 5 families in this valley were being systematically robbed and had no idea," she said. "That's the story. The registrar's inquiry is the story. The ledger is the story." She looked at him steadily. "My personal circumstances are not the story." He wrote it the way she wanted. Piece ran in the territorial paper 8 days after the filing, and it was thorough and specific and named Vernon Slade explicitly, and it named the properties, and it reproduced a portion of the methodology Mara had documented. It did not mention her personal circumstances. It referred to her as the Iron Willow accounts manager, which was accurate enough. Slade's response was to appear at a community meeting in town 3 days after the piece ran, with Waverly beside him and several of his business associates, and to make the argument that the whole affair was a conspiracy orchestrated by outsiders who didn't understand the valley and had a personal agenda. He was smooth about it. He was still pleasant. He had answers for most of the specific claims, technical answers, the kind that sound plausible if you don't look at the actual documents. Kellerman was in the back of that meeting. He stood up. Kellerman was not a man built for public speaking. He was a rancher, broad-shouldered and private, with no gift for rhetoric and no particular desire to develop one. He stood up and he said, his plain, weathered voice, exactly what had happened to his ranch over the past 2 years, the losses, the invoice discrepancies, the way the debt had grown without visible cause, the way he'd blamed himself. He held the copy of Mara's cross-referenced analysis in his hand while he talked. He didn't quote from it. He just held it, the way a man holds something solid when he's in uncertain territory. When he sat down, Osterfeld stood up, then Frank Calloway. Then a man named Ruiz, whom Mara hadn't even identified yet, who'd heard about the inquiry through the territorial piece and had driven 40 miles to say his piece. Slade's pleasant face developed, across that hour, a quality she'd never seen on it before. It was very small, very controlled, but she recognized it, the face of a man doing arithmetic that isn't working out. The meeting didn't end anything. These things never ended clean. But something shifted in that room, and it was the thing she'd told Rourke it would be. Not a legal victory, not yet, but the end of isolation. 5 men standing up in a room and saying, "It happened to me too, and I'm not ashamed, and I'm not afraid." Afterward, in the yard outside the meeting hall, she stood in the cold and watched people coming out and felt Rourke beside her, close enough that she could have touched his arm if she'd wanted to. She didn't, but the awareness of it was there, quiet and specific. Briggs was watching Slade's face when the Calloways stood up, Rourke said. "I noticed. Briggs is a practical man, not corrupt, just practical. He goes where the weight is." He paused. The weight just shifted. "The registrar will rule on the preliminary inquiry next week," she said. "Harrington says the evidence supports at least a temporary freeze on all foreclosure activity while the full case is evaluated. That buys months. It buys enough." She looked at the meeting hall doors, still open, people filing out in the cold air. "The Ruiz property. I didn't know about that one. If his records show the same pattern, that's 9 properties. 9 is not anomalous misfortune. 9 is a system. We'll go see him tomorrow if you're—" Rourke stopped. "If you have time." She looked at him. He was staring at the meeting hall doors, hands in his coat pockets, hat pulled against the wind. "Rourke." He looked at her. "We'll go see him tomorrow," she said. He nodded. They stood there for another moment in the cold, and then turned and walked back toward where the wagon was tied. Toby was asleep in the wagon bed, bundled in blankets, Gil sitting beside him with the patience of a very old dog. He'd insisted on coming, had argued his case to Mara with considerable vigor, and had been asleep since they reached the edge of town. Rourke looked down at him for a moment, this small sleeping shape in the lamplight, one fist curled beside his face. He argued that he should be allowed to vote, Rourke said. He argues a lot of things. He's going to be trouble when he's older. He's trouble now, Mara said. He's just small enough that people underestimate it. Rourke made a quiet sound that was adjacent to a laugh. His ribs were still healing, and he was careful about laughing, but it was there. Climbed up onto the wagon seat, slowly but without asking for help, which she'd learned was a thing he needed, to do the difficult things himself even when it cost him. She got up on the other side. Gil handed Toby forward, and the boy stirred and relocated himself against Mara's side without fully waking, the boneless total trust of a child who has decided where he's safe. They drove back to Iron Willow in the dark. A week after the meeting, the registrar ruled. Harrington brought the document to the ranch himself, which told her something about how significant he considered it. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd gone through 4 sets of ledgers, where Osterfeld had shaken his head over his own accounts, where Kellerman had looked at the window to keep from being seen crying, and he laid the document down and said, "Preliminary findings support a full fraud inquiry. All foreclosure actions against named properties are suspended pending outcome. Slade's collateral claims against the water rights on this property are suspended. His office has 45 days to respond with counter-documentation." Rourke looked at the document for a long time. 45 days, he said. In 45 days, if his counter-documentation is insufficient, which I believe it will be, the registrar schedules a formal hearing. That hearing is public. The evidence goes on the record permanently. Harrington paused. This isn't over. I want to be clear about that. He has money, and he has lawyers, and he has 45 days to find something we missed. Did we miss anything? Rourke asked. Harrington looked at Mara. She looked at her hands. She thought about 51 pages and 11 days and 4 ledgers and the operational book with V.S. embossed on the cover. If we miss something, she said, I'll find it before he does. Harrington almost smiled. I believe you. He closed his briefcase. There's one more thing. The Territorial Attorney's Office has been in contact. Given the Scale 9 properties, the 3-year timeline, the level of documentation, they're considering whether to open a parallel criminal inquiry. Kitchen was very quiet. Criminal, Rourke said. Fraud at this scale, with this level of documentation, crosses into criminal territory. It's not guaranteed. These things rarely move quickly, but it's on the table. He stood up. In the meantime, Maddox, you have a ranch to run. The freeze gives you space. Use it. He left. Rourke sat at the table. Mara sat across from him. Outside, she could hear Toby in the yard with Dan Pruitt, the familiar one-sided conversation of a child instructing an adult in something the adult already knows. The winter light came through the kitchen window, pale and flat, the particular light of January in Wyoming that promises nothing but delivers a kind of brutal clarity, everything sharp, nothing soft, the world exactly as it is. He's not done, Rourke said. No, he has 45 days, and he'll use every one of them. The ranchers have standing now. The water rights are frozen. Yes, she looked at him. You built something here that he wanted very badly. He put 3 years into trying to take it. He's not going to walk away because the registrar told him to. I know. He was looking at the window. I've been thinking about the community, the other ranchers. Even when this resolves, if it resolves, they're going to be rebuilding for years. Some of them don't have the reserves to recover without help. She'd been thinking the same thing. She'd been thinking about it since Kellerman had looked at the window to keep from being seen crying. The bookkeeping work I've been doing, the account reconstruction, that's something I could do for other ranches. Properly, as a service, help them build systems that don't have the same vulnerabilities. Supply coordination, invoice verification, the kind of oversight that makes this harder to do to someone. Rourke looked at her. That's a business. I know what it is. You'd need a base of operations. She didn't say anything. He looked at the window again. Something moved across his face, deliberate, considered, the look of a man choosing his words for once, instead of just saying them. You could base it here, he said. From Iron Willow. If you wanted. He stopped. That's a separate conversation. Just it's an option that exists. I know it exists, she said. They sat with that for a moment, the option that existed, not yet agreed to or declined, just present in the room like the winter light clear, unsoft, and there. Then Toby burst through the back door with his boots still on, which she told him 17 times not to do, announcing that Dan had taught him how to knock a nail and did she want to see the fence post he'd improved. And the moment opened up into the ordinary business of the afternoon, and Mara got up to deal with the boots, and Rourke got up to see about the fence post, and Iron Willow Ranch moved forward into the rest of the day. The 45 days did not pass quietly. Slade's counter-documentation arrived on day 38, a thick package delivered to Harrington's temporary office above the Copper Ridge Land Registry. Assembled with the kind of professional thoroughness that money buys when it's applied with urgency. Waverly had been busy. There were affidavits from the feed suppliers disputing Mara's invoice analysis, an alternative accounting of the cattle losses attributed to documented predator activity and weather events, and a legal argument that the operational ledger found on Iron Willow's fence line was inadmissible because its provenance could not be established beyond reasonable doubt. Harrington brought it to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, set it on the kitchen table, and let Mara read it without commentary. She read it twice. Then she said, "The predator documentation is fabricated." The dates on 3 of the incident reports correspond to weeks where Rourke's own hands have contemporaneous records, placing them in the north pasture without observing any predator activity. And the feed supplier affidavits, she turned to a specific page, are signed by the same notary on the same day. 4 separate suppliers, all notarized in the same office on the same afternoon. That's not independent corroboration. That's coordination. Harrington was watching her. Can you demonstrate that? The notary stamp has a sequential registration number. These 4 documents have numbers that run consecutively, which means they were processed one after another. No independent supplier driving from 4 different locations would arrive at the same notary in sequence unless they were brought there together. She set the page down. And the predator reports Rourke keeps daily logs. He's kept them for 3 years. I'll need a week to cross-reference every date they've cited. You have 5 days before the registrar's response deadline. Then I'll need 4. She worked through the counter-documentation, the way she'd worked through everything else methodically, without anger, treating it as a puzzle rather than an attack. Rourke brought coffee and kept Toby out of the kitchen and otherwise left her alone, which was exactly what she needed. By the second day, she'd found 6 specific contradictions. By the third day, she had 9. By the fourth day, when she laid her response document next to Waverly's package, the accumulated weight of the discrepancies was not subtle. The notary alone was enough. Harrington confirmed it, a single notary processing 4 supposedly independent affidavits in a single afternoon was a procedural irregularity, significant enough to challenge the entire submission's credibility. Combined with the log contradictions and 3 additional cross-references Mara found in Slade's own operational ledger that directly contradicted his counter-documentation, the response that Harrington filed on day 43 was, in his measured professional opinion, substantially stronger than what they'd originally submitted. The registrar scheduled the formal hearing for the second week of March. That gave them 3 more weeks, and those 3 weeks had a different quality than the ones before them. The acute crisis had passed, not the situation, but the edge of it, the feeling that everything could collapse at any moment. What remained was something harder in a different way, the slow, grinding work of preparation, of making sure nothing was missed, of waiting for a process that moved at its own pace, regardless of how urgently you needed it to move faster. Mara used the time. She went to see the Ruiz property, 40 miles east, with Rourke driving and Toby sitting between them asking questions about the landscape. She spent a day with Augustine Ruiz and his wife Carmen going through 4 years of records and found what she expected to find, and added their documentation to the growing file. She went back to Osterfeld and the Callaways and made sure their statements were complete and consistent. She wrote letters to 2 other ranchers she'd heard about, through Kellerman people, who hadn't come forward yet, who'd heard about the inquiry but hadn't decided whether to join it. One of them wrote back, His name was Britton, and he'd lost his property to foreclosure 14 months ago, which meant he was outside the window of the current inquiry. But his records, which he'd kept out of some stubborn instinct, even after losing everything, showed the same methodology applied with the same patience. Harrington said it couldn't reverse the foreclosure in this proceeding, but it could be used to demonstrate the historical scope of the scheme. And that scope mattered for the criminal inquiry that the Territorial Attorney's Office was still quietly building. She thought about Britton a lot. A man who'd lost his ranch and kept his records anyway, not knowing why, just keeping them because something in him insisted the numbers were important, even when they couldn't save him anymore. She thought there was something worth noticing in that, the way people hold on to evidence of wrongs done to them, even when they can't see how it'll ever matter. Sometimes it matters later. Sometimes it takes someone else coming along who knows how to read what you've been carrying. She wrote him a letter. Not a legal letter, a personal one. She told him what his records had contributed, and why it mattered, and that she understood something about holding on to things that seemed useless and discovering they weren't. He wrote back 3 words, "Thank you, Mrs. Ellsworth." Kept the letter. The morning of the hearing, Mara was up before 4. She wasn't anxious, exactly. She'd learned years ago that anxiety about things you couldn't control was a tax on energy you needed for things you could, and she'd been more or less consistent about not paying that tax. What she was alert, the particular alertness of someone who has done all the preparation available to them and is now simply waiting to see whether it was enough. She dressed quietly, went to the kitchen, built the fire up, and made coffee. Rourke appeared at 4:30, which didn't surprise her. He moved carefully still. The ribs had healed mostly, but mostly wasn't completely, and cold mornings reminded him of the distinction. He poured coffee and sat down across from her, and they sat in the firelight for a while without talking, which had become, somewhere in the past 6 weeks, a thing they could do without it being uncomfortable. "You nervous?" he asked finally. "No." He looked at her. "A little," she said. "Good, means you know it matters." "I know it matters without being nervous about it." "And yet," he said. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I keep thinking about what happens if the counter-argument lands. If the registrar decides the ledger's provenance is genuinely questionable and throws it out. Then we argue on the other documentation, which is strong but not definitive without the ledger." She looked at the fire. "It's the center of the whole case. Everything else corroborates it. Without it, we have a pattern that a good lawyer can attribute to coincidence and poor ranch management. Waverly's not that good. Waverly's good enough." She turned her cup in her hands. "But the notary sequence, that's real. Harrington says that's real." "Then trust what's real." She looked at him. He said it simply, like it was obvious, like it was the most practical thing in the world. Trust what's real. After 6 weeks of watching him operate, she understood that this was not naivete. It was a philosophy built on hard experience. The understanding that a man who works with actual cattle and actual land and actual weather long enough learns to stop arguing with what is and start working with it. She'd built her whole adult life on numbers, and numbers were the most real thing she knew. The numbers said they had a case. She would trust the numbers. "All right," she said. Toby was awake by 6, which was early even for him, and she suspected he'd absorbed the morning's weight the way he always did through some system of child perception that bypassed language entirely and went straight to atmosphere. He was unusually cooperative about breakfast and getting dressed, which was its own kind of signal. When Rourke came back from the barn, Toby was waiting by the door with his coat already on. "I'm coming," he announced. Rourke looked at Mara. "It's a legal hearing," she said to Toby. "It's going to be long and slow, and you'll have to sit still." Toby weighed this. "I can sit still." This was objectively false, and all 3 of them knew it. But Mara looked at her son's face, serious and ready, the face he made when he'd decided something, and thought about what it meant that he wanted to be there, and thought about what it meant to teach a child that the things that matter require your presence, even when your presence is difficult. "Gil stays with you in the back," she said. "The moment you can't sit still, Gil takes you outside." No arguing. "Okay," Toby said immediately, which meant he'd already planned to argue but was revising. They drove to town in the early light, Toby between them again. The valley, spread out on either side of the road in the thin winter sun. The snow had pulled back from the south-facing slopes, revealing the dead grass beneath, pale and flattened. The landscape in that particular state of winter end, where everything is still brown, but there's a pressure underneath it, the ground building towards something. Spring was still weeks away, but it was in there, getting ready. The hearing was held in the county land office, a room that was too small for the number of people who showed up, which was itself a statement. Ranchers Mara recognized, and some she didn't, townspeople, the territorial newspaper correspondent Garrett in the back with his notebook, the uncomfortable Sheriff Briggs near the door. Kellerman and the Callaways arrived together and sat in the third row. Osterfeld came with his wife, who shook Mara's hand with both of hers before sitting down. Slade arrived with Waverly and 2 associates and sat on the opposite side of the room, and his pleasant face was in place, and he nodded to several people as he sat down. The practiced ease of a man who has been the most important person in a room so many times that he carries it like a posture. Mara sat beside Harrington at the front table and organized her documents and did not look at Slade. The registrar was a woman, which surprised some people in the room and did not surprise Mara at all. She'd dealt with enough county offices in enough places to know that the people who actually ran the detailed procedural machinery of local government were often women, because detail work and procedural rigor were skills that had been available to women even when most other professional avenues were not. Her name was Aldridge, and she was 60 or thereabouts, with the compact, precise manner of someone who has heard every argument and been moved by almost none of them. Called the hearing to order, and it began. Harrington presented first. He was methodical and clear, and he let the documents do most of the work, which was the right instinct. You don't argue with the registrar when the registrar is perfectly capable of reading. You give her what she needs to read and get out of the way. He walked through the Iron Willow documentation, the cross-ranching pattern, the Slade operational ledger, and the notary sequence problem in the counter-documentation, and he was done in 40 minutes. Waverly took an hour and 10 minutes, and he was good she'd been right about that. He had a particular gift for making specific things sound general, and general things sound specific, and he worked the ledger provenance angle hard, and he made a credible argument that the notary sequence could be explained by coordinated legal preparation rather than witness coaching, which was technically true and technically irrelevant, and he knew it, and she knew it, and she suspected Aldridge knew it too. Then Aldridge asked questions. She asked Harrington 3 questions about the chain of custody of the ledger, which he answered with the documentation they'd prepared. She asked Waverly 2 questions about the notary sequence, and his answers were careful and long, which was itself an answer of a kind. Then she looked at Mara, Mrs. Ellsworth. You compiled the primary analysis. Yes, ma'am. You're not a licensed accountant. No, ma'am. I kept accounts for a freight operation for 6 years, and I've spent the past 6 weeks doing this specific work. The cross-referencing methodology you used walked me through it. Mara walked her through it, she explained, plainly and without professional vocabulary, how she'd identified the discrepancy pattern, how she'd verified it across multiple property records, how the Slade ledger's internal structure matched the methodology she'd found in the ranch books, not just in general terms, but specifically in the particular way the timing was calibrated and the amounts were distributed to avoid triggering suspicion. Aldridge listened without expression. You've done this before, she said. Identified financial manipulation. No, Mara said. But I've been the victim of it. I recognize the shape of it. Aldridge looked at her for a moment. Then she made a note. The hearing recessed for 2 hours while Aldridge reviewed the documentation. Mara went outside and stood in the cold with Rourke and Gill and Toby, who had in fact sat still for the entire morning on the strength of pure determined willpower, and was now releasing the accumulated energy of that effort by running in circles in the yard outside the land office. How do you think it went? Rourke asked. I don't know. She watched Toby run. Careful. That's good and bad. A careful person takes the evidence seriously. A careful person also doesn't move until they're sure. Are we sure? I'm sure. Whether the documentation gives her enough to be sure, she stopped. I think so. But I've thought things before and been wrong. Kellerman came to stand beside them. He had his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way people do when they need something to do with their hands. "Whatever happens today," he said, "this isn't what it would have been if we'd faced it alone. I want you to know that." He said it to Rourke, and then looked at Mara. "Both of you." Mara nodded. "My wife wants to have you for dinner," Kellerman said. "When this is over, both of you. The boy, too." "We'd like that," Rourke said. They went back in when the recess ended. Aldridge came back with her notes and her expression, which had not changed, and she sat down and looked at the room and said, in the direct, economical way of a person who respects other people's time, that she had reached a preliminary determination. The Slade operational ledger was admissible. The circumstances of its recovery documented by 2 witnesses, consistent with the physical conditions of the storms, were sufficient to establish provenance within the standard the proceeding required. The notary sequence in the counter-documentation represented a procedural irregularity that compromised the credibility of the affidavits in question. The pattern of financial manipulation, documented across 9 properties, in conjunction with the operational ledger, constituted sufficient evidence to sustain a finding of systematic fraud. All contested foreclosure actions were voided. The water rights claim against Iron Willow was permanently dismissed. The matter was referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office for criminal inquiry. She said it all in the same tone she'd used throughout: clear, specific, procedurally precise. She did not make it dramatic. It was, nonetheless, the most dramatic thing Mara had heard in a very long time. The room was not quiet for long. Slade stood up. For the first time, the pleasant face had slipped not into rage, not into anything so readable, but into something tight and unfinished, a face that had lost its arrangement and hadn't found a new one yet. He said something to Waverly. Waverly put a hand on his arm. Slade shook it off. He looked across the room. Not at Harrington. Not at Rourke. At Mara. She met it. Same as the first time. Same as every time. Then he picked up his hat and walked out, and Waverly followed, and the room broke open into noise. She didn't feel victorious, which she'd half expected and half not. What she felt was the particular flatness of having spent enormous effort on something and having it resolved correctly, the satisfaction of a balance sheet that finally adds up. It was a quiet feeling. It was enough. Rourke was beside her, and she felt his hand just briefly, just once on her shoulder. Not demonstrative, not a statement. Just there and then gone. That was enough, too. Kellerman shook her hand. Osterfeld's wife embraced her. Frank Calloway, who had said almost nothing to her in the entire 6 weeks of their acquaintance, stopped beside her on his way out and said, "Good work," and walked away, which from Frank Calloway she suspected was an extended speech. Toby had fallen asleep against Gil's side in the back of the room, arms crossed, head tilted, completely collapsed, in the way that only children who have heroically held themselves together for hours can collapse. Rourke looked at him, and then looked at Mara with something that was absolutely a smile, quiet and private, and she looked away before it could settle into anything she wasn't ready for. They drove back to Iron Willow in the late afternoon, the sun already dropping toward the western ridge, the light going that particular gold that belongs specifically to late winter days when the sky is clear and cold, and the world looks briefly, improbably beautiful. Toby slept the whole way. The weeks that followed were not effortless. She would not have trusted them if they had been. There was the work of unwinding 9 property cases through the registrar's office, each one requiring its own documentation and correspondence. There was the territorial attorney's criminal inquiry, which moved slowly and required Harrington's ongoing involvement and several more of Mara's working days. There was the Britton case, the man who'd already lost his property, which Harrington eventually argued successfully before a separate panel on the grounds of the historical fraud evidence, resulting in a settlement that gave Britton enough to start over, if not to reclaim exactly what he'd lost. Slade's operation collapsed not all at once but piece by piece. The way things built on false premises tend to collapse each element, undermining the next, the network of suppliers and intermediaries and colluding vendors choosing, one by one, to cooperate with the inquiry rather than protect a man who could no longer protect them. The criminal case took 18 months to resolve. When it did, Slade left Copper Ridge, which was its own kind of verdict, even before the legal one was formally rendered. Iron Willow recovered. It recovered the way real things recover gradually, with setbacks, with 2 weeks in March, when a late cold snap took 7 calves, and Rourke walked around with his jaw set for days, and a supply arrangement that fell through in April and had to be rebuilt from scratch, and a fence repair that cost twice what it should have, because the lumber supplier doubled his rates the moment the spring work rush began. Not clean, not triumphant, just slowly better. Mara built the bookkeeping service she'd described to Rourke in the kitchen that winter evening, the option that exists. She used Iron Willow as her base of operations, which was a practical arrangement, and also something more than that, which she was by spring willing to acknowledge to herself, if not yet to anyone else. Took on 4 client ranches by June, 7 by autumn. She hired a young woman named Petra from Copper Ridge, who had a gift for numbers and no obvious outlet for it, and trained her the way James had trained Mara, by showing her the work and letting her learn from what she found. She thought about James sometimes, not with the particular grief of the first year, which had been a physical thing, a pain that lived in specific parts of her body. More with the complicated love you develop for people who shaped you before you knew you were being shaped. He'd been careless with money and trusting to a fault, and she'd loved him completely, and she would have changed 100 things about how his life ended, but she would not have changed what his life had taught her. Because what it had taught her was the thing that had saved Iron Willow, and Kellerman, and Osterfeld, and Britton, and 8 other families she could name. You hold on to the evidence. You learn to read what other people can't. You don't stop looking just because the looking is hard. She thought he would have liked Rourke, which was a thought she didn't examine too carefully, but didn't turn away from either. The conversation happened in late April at the rebuilt northern fence. She'd come out because Rourke had been there since noon, and it was past 4 and nobody had brought him lunch, and she'd found him sitting on the top rail looking out at the north pasture where the cattle were grazing in the early spring grass. The first real grass of the season, green in a way that made Wyoming in April feel like an apology for Wyoming in January. She handed him the food and sat on the rail beside him, which was a thing she'd stopped thinking about carefully, because thinking about it carefully made it awkward, and it wasn't awkward. It was just sitting on a fence with a person she'd been working alongside for 4 months. They ate. Below them, somewhere in the middle of the herd, a calf was trying to figure out running, making the lurching, overcorrected attempts of something that has the instinct, but not yet the coordination. Its mother watched with the patient, resigned expression that mothers across species seem to develop very early. Toby told Ellis this morning that he's going to be a rancher, Rourke said. Toby told me last week he was going to be a horse. She finished her bread. His career plans are fluid. When Ellis asked him which ranch, Toby said Rourke stopped. Something shifted in his expression, and he looked out at the pasture, and then he said it anyway. He said this one. Mara was quiet. Kids say things, she said. They do. He was still looking at the pasture. Mara. Yes. He turned and looked at her directly, which he'd always done. She'd noticed that from the first night, the directness of him, the absence of performance. I want to say this right, he said. So I'm going to go slow. All right. When I made that first promise that night, I made it because he was sick and you were out of options, and it was the only decent thing to do. That's all it was. I know that. But somewhere in the middle of all of this, he gestured, a small, vague motion that she understood encompassed 4 months of ledgers and fence cuts and blizzards and hearings and coffee at 4 a.m. Somewhere in there, it stopped being about decency. And I don't want to... He stopped again. The man who was usually economical with words was finding this one difficult, and she let him find it without helping, because some things deserve to be found at their own pace. I don't want to treat you like a debt I collected, he said finally. Or a woman I rescued, which I didn't. Or someone who owes me something, which you don't. I don't want you to stay here because it's practical, or because you feel obligated, or because the option exists. I want another stop. Shorter this time. I want you to stay because you choose it. Because you choose this. Me, the ranch, whatever this is. Calf below them got running, figured out for approximately 4 seconds, and then lost it entirely and sat down. Mara looked at the pasture. She'd been careful, all these months, for reasons she'd understood, and reasons she'd told herself, and reasons that were real. She was not a woman who moved quickly, who trusted easily, who let the gratitude of a rescued moment become the architecture of the rest of her life. She'd watched other women do that, and she'd understood why, and she hadn't judged them, but she'd also known that was not her way. What she knew, sitting on the fence rail in the April sun, was that this had not been a rescued moment. What had started as a rescued moment had become something built the way Iron Willow had been built, with work and mistakes and setbacks and the specific, unglamorous labor of people who show up and keep showing up. That was not gratitude. That was not obligation. She knew what it was. "I'm not going to be easy to be with," she said. "I work at odd hours, and I have opinions about accounts that most people find excessive, and I've been managing things alone long enough that I'm not always sure how to let someone else manage anything." "I noticed," he said. Toby is a full situation. He's going to have thoughts about everything for the rest of his natural life, and he's going to share them all." "I've noticed that, too." Something moved in Rourke's voice warmth, genuine and unguarded, the voice he only used around the boy. "I don't find it excessive." She looked at him. She'd spent 11 months being afraid in the specific way of a person who has been stripped down to the minimum and knows in the core of themselves how little that minimum is. She knew this man. She knew his hands and his ledgers and his particular brand of stubbornness, and the face he made when he was in pain and trying not to show it, and the face he made when Toby said something that caught him off guard. She knew his ranch and what it had cost him and what he was willing to do to keep it. She knew that when he made a promise, he meant it in the most fundamental sense, not as a statement of intention, but as a description of what was already true. "I choose this," she said. "I choose you." He let out a breath. "Equal partners," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the completion of something, the end of a sentence that had been building for months. "Equal partners," she confirmed. He didn't move dramatically. He didn't say anything else immediately. He looked back at the pasture, and she looked at the pasture, and they sat on the fence rail together, while the calf tried running again and got a little further this time. They married in June. It was small and without ceremony in the elaborate sense. The families of the ranchers they'd helped, Harrington, the Pruett brothers, Gil, who cleaned up so thoroughly for the occasion that nobody recognized him initially, and Petra, who cried in the efficient way of someone who thinks crying is appropriate but prefers to complete it quickly. Toby stood beside Rourke throughout, which had been his own decision, arrived at, and announced with the same certainty he applied to all his positions. At one point during the brief proceedings, he reached up and took Rourke's hand, not because anyone had told him to, just because it was there and he wanted to, and Rourke looked down at him and then looked away at something in the middle distance. And the set of his jaw was the particular set that meant he was doing the same thing Kellerman had done in his kitchen that morning. And for the same reason, the weight of something had shifted, and feeling it shift required a moment of looking away. Mara saw it. She filed it in the part of herself where she kept things, the small and growing collection of things she wasn't ready to examine but was never going to lose. Toby started calling him Pa sometime around August. Not with announcement, not with drama. He just did it one morning at breakfast and then kept doing it, and Rourke absorbed it with the same quiet, complete attention he gave to anything that mattered. And the subject was never discussed because it didn't need to be discussed. It was simply true. There is something worth saying about what happened in Copper Ridge, not as a story that ended well, because endings are never as clean as they appear from the outside, but as a true account of what certain people are capable of when pushed entirely to the edge of what they have. Most people in that position make reasonable decisions. The boarding house woman made a reasonable decision. The storekeeper made a reasonable decision. Even Prentice, the doctor, made a reasonable decision until he was given the cover of darkness and a back door and a man willing to take the risk on his behalf. Reasonable decisions are not evil. They are, most of the time, simply reasonable. But the cumulative weight of a town full of reasonable decisions is a woman standing in 20-degree weather with a feverish child and nowhere to go. And someone has to be willing to make the unreasonable decision, the one that costs more than it should, the one that doesn't calculate, the one that says, that boy won't spend another night without a roof as long as I own one. What Mara understood, by the time the spring grass came in and Iron Willow's herd was whole and her accounts were balanced, and her son was running across the yard toward a man who would always, for the rest of his life, be the person she measured other forms of reliability against. What she understood was that the unreasonable decision is not actually unreasonable. It's simply unwilling to do the math that excludes certain people from the calculation. Rourke had not excluded her from the calculation. On a January night in a blizzard, with no particular reason to do otherwise, he had looked at her and looked at Toby, and simply not excluded them. That was the whole of it. That was the thing she'd never been able to explain when people asked about the story later, how it had started, what had made the difference, why Iron Willow was still standing when Slade's operation was not. A man who did not look away. The rest followed. Iron Willow did not become the largest ranch in the valley. Rourke had never wanted the largest ranch. He'd wanted a working one, and that's what it was, working. Unglamorous, weathered, solvent. Mara's bookkeeping operations served 11 client ranches by the end of the second year, and she added a supply coordination service that helped smaller ranchers negotiate collective terms with suppliers, which turned out to be the thing the valley had needed for a long time, and nobody had thought to build. She thought about what Slade had been building, in his way a network of dependencies, a web of leverage, a system designed to make other people's weakness into his permanent asset. And she thought about what she'd built, which was almost the inverse, a network of shared information, a web of mutual accountability, a system designed to make other people's records into their own permanent protection. Same instinct, entirely different direction. Toby grew up at Iron Willow, knowing both the work and the weight of it, knowing that land required tending and accounts required honesty, and people required the willingness to stand up in rooms and say what happened to them. He grew up watching. His mother read ledgers at odd hours, and his father moved cattle in bad weather, and he grew up knowing that neither of those things was glamorous, and both of those things were how the world actually held together. He turned out to be, as Rourke had predicted that first spring, pretty patient when it came to Clydesdales. And when he was 11 years old, on October afternoon, while helping Mara check the quarterly invoices, he found a discrepancy in a supplier's delivery record that she'd missed. She looked at it. He was right. She looked at her son, who was waiting with the focused, unsentimental certainty of someone who knows what the numbers say. "Good catch," she said. He went back to the page and kept working, and Mara watched him for a moment, this child who had been feverish in her arms on a January night in a town that had decided he was somebody else's problem, bent over a ledger at the kitchen table of Iron Willow Ranch, learning to read what other people can't. She went back to her own page and kept working too. The fire was going well. The accounts were clean. Outside, the October light was doing what October light does in Wyoming gold, and brief and completely indifferent to how beautiful it is. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what she had chosen.